Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the September 16th, 2013 meeting of the Town of Los Gatos Joint Town Council Parking Authority meeting. First of all, would you please silence or put on vibrate your cell phones? And secondly, if you intend to address us this evening on an agenda item or on verbal communications, please fill out and submit to the clerk, over here to my left, one of these buff-colored cards. Thank you. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Thank you and good evening. Joe Przynski.
Here.
Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Diane McNutt.
Here.
Stephen Leonardis.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Barbara Spector.
Here. At this time, I would like Junte Bion to come up here. And while he's coming up here, I will explain that each meeting we have a special young person from our community join us to lead the pledge to the flag. While he's standing up here, get a little closer so they can see you. Let me tell you something about Bion, Junte. He's a 10th grader at Los Gatos High School. He is on the Los Gatos Youth Commission. He was an alternate in 2012-13, and he was appointed as a full commissioner for 2013-14. So he is a full youth commissioner at this time. He enjoys history, social studies, and English. He plays violin in the Los Gatos High School Orchestra. He works on El Gato, which is the high school newspaper. He participates in speech and debate. He's a volunteer at the Los Gatos Library. He's a member of Interact Club, which is a community service club, and in his spare time, he is a very serious tennis player. Let's give him a round of applause. If you'll please stand and join us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you.
Another round of applause. Our youth commissioners are a fantastic group of people, and he is just one example, but a stellar example. Ms. Prop, closed session report.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Council did not meet in closed session this evening, and there's no report.
Now we have council town manager reports, beginning with council matters. Does anybody on the council have anything to report out? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. On September 5th, I attended 2 meetings on behalf of the town. One was with the West Valley Solid Waste Management Advisory Authority, and the main purpose of the meeting was to consider a contract extension because currently the services don't go beyond 2013. And the other meeting was with the Santa Clara County Water District and Santa Clara Valley Water District. And from that meeting, the most important thing we gathered was we're having a California Coastal Cleanup Day this weekend, September 21st, from 9 to noon. And you can register online at www.cleanacreek.org if you would like to participate in that. You have to be 16 or older or accompanied by an adult.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Anybody else? Mr. Przynski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. On September 5th, I chaired the VTA Board of Directors meeting, and on September 12th, I represented the town of Los Gatos at the Cities Association of Santa Clara County.
Thank you. As in my role as chair of the North 40 Advisory Committee, I, along with Sandy Bailey, who I know is over there somewhere, there she is, went to a meeting of the Cambrian Community Council to report out to them about what is happening with the North 40 specific plan. Thank you, Sandy, for joining me in that. Manager matters.
Mayor and Council, 3 items. First, this Saturday is the Fall Wine Walk, co-sponsored with the Chamber of Commerce from 1:30 to 5:30 in the Central Business District of downtown Los Gatos. On Friday, the 27th, the town is once again sponsoring its annual Screen on the Green at Oak Meadow Park with the rides open and kids' activities and a showing of Brave from 6:30 to 9:30 p.m.
I'm sorry, what date was that?
Friday, September 27th.
Okay, thank you.
And then by October 18th, we're asking residents to apply for one of 21 openings on our 7 boards and commissions, including the Planning Commission, Community Services Commission, Arts Commission, Transportation Commission, Parks Commission, almost all of them. And that deadline is October 18th. Tonight's Did You Know is on a long-awaited project in town, the University Avenue Highway 9 intersection improvements. And presenting tonight's Did You Know will be Kevin Rohani, Town Engineer and Assistant Director of Parks and Public Works.
Did you know the town of Los Gatos, in coordination with Caltrans, has undertaken improvements to the intersection of Highway 9 and University Avenue? The goal of this project is to improve the operation and safety of the intersection both for vehicles, pedestrian, and bicyclists. Some of the major components of this project include construction of a new traffic signal system to replace the very old and outdated signal that's been there for over 4 decades, installation of dedicated left turn lanes on University Avenue into Highway 9. These will improve the operation of University Avenue and travel through that intersection greatly. In addition, on Highway 9, there will be improvements and extension of the left turn lane from westbound Highway 9 into University Avenue, which again, in turns, will facilitate greatly the travel through that intersection from Highway 9 and eliminate a lot of the backup problems that we have experienced over the years. In addition, that intersection, all corners will receive new sidewalks, curb gutters, and ADA ramps to bring that intersection into compliance with current codes. Upon the completion of the project, we would be resurfacing and restriping that entire intersection to give it a brand new look with a new signal system. This project was funded, Town of Los Gatos pursued grant funding. It was a federal funding from the Highway Safety Implementation Program. The construction we expect to start by next month in October, and anticipated completion of the project and grand opening would be spring of next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rahani. We are now at the consent calendar portion of our meeting. The consent calendar items will be voted upon and decided in one motion unless an item of the consent calendar is pulled from that calendar. I will first look to the council to see if anybody here wants to pull an item from the consent calendar. Seeing no one. Does anyone from the audience wish to pull an item from the consent calendar? I do not have a card to that effect. Seeing no one coming forward, I will look to the council for a motion. Mr. Przynski?
Madam Mayor, I move to approve the consent agenda.
Mr. Vice Mayor?
Second.
All right, motion and second. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Consent calendar passes unanimously. We now go to verbal communications, which is the opportunity for anyone here to speak to us on any item, not on the agenda, for any other item for up to 3 minutes. I have requested that you submit a card, and a lot of you have. First person, and if you'll come up here, you'll have 3 minutes. Barry Chang.
Honorable Mayor, Specter, and council member. My name is Barry Chen. I'm a Cupertino City Council member, but I'm here to represent him base, not not representing the city council. I'm here to asking you to file amicus brief in support of base lawsuit against Lehigh Southwest cement plant on the west right issue, because we do need to have, in the modern day, we do need to have a conditional use permit. The county approved is just outrageous. Okay, just give them the pretty much free hand, and which is not protecting our residents' health, given the fact that Lehigh has a lot of violation with EPA, with water district, and also with the state mining board. I have sent a request in, I believe it's August 22nd or 23rd, with a supporting document with notice of violation from EPA, and also a copy of the amicus brief information from my attorney. I give it to the clerk, so they will give you a copy, and then also Winford Hill also supported. Right now, we have Mid-Peninsula Open Space sign up for the joint amicus brief, and Town of Los Altos Hills and Los Altos. And then tomorrow night, Cupertino City Council, this item is on the agenda, so I'll keep you updated if we get it passed or not. I'm working very hard. Okay, tomorrow night. So please help, because this, for a small amount of money, we're not asking you more. If we can allocate, probably not go over $5,000. And then the Mid-Peninsula Open Space will draft up the amicus brief, which means you staff doesn't have to spend much of time, a minimum time, and then that will show that you helping protecting the environment and also the health of the resident, because the air pollution has no boundary. Of course, Cupertino, because closer, we get a little bit heavier, but Los Gatos also get some, okay? And the water pollution, Lehigh just settled the lawsuit with the Sierra Club, you know, and then that they have to fix up the selenium water pollution issue. That could cost them at least $12 million to $60 million, depends on how much the work to be done. So that means a serious violation there. Okay, so I'm really asking for your help. The Lehigh they know how to work on the political end. They hire former Cupertino mayor as their public relation manager. They hire our former state assembly as their paid consultant, so they got everybody under their control. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Well, you actually have 30 seconds more if you want it.
Oh, no. Oh. Thank you very much. But, you know, please do it. Just show a small amount of money, show a goodwill that we are elected for, to protect the public health, and then also the environment for the many generation to come. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Karen Del Compare, or Compare.
Yes, hello, my name is Karen Del Compare. Dear council members, I also urge you to join the Mid-Penn Regional Open Space District, Los Altos, and Los Altos City Council in filing an amicus brief in the case of No Toxic Air versus Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County improperly designated several areas of their mining operation as vested, even though their own staff report supported a different conclusion. This decision sets an unacceptable precedent that could be used statewide in cases determining vested rights. This would take away the power of regulatory agencies such as city councils and counties to regulate effects of noise, light, dust, visual effects, regulation of hours of operation, and other conditions. Since so many other cities and the Mid-Penn are joining, the costs to the Los Gatos would likely be quite minimal. In conclusion, there's a great potential benefit with very little downside to the city. Thank you very much for your consideration in this matter.
Thank you. Paul DeWicki.
Good evening. I'm Paul DeWicki. I've lived in Los Gatos for about 10 years now. I lived in the Santa Clara County for over 30 years. What I want to talk to you about is the lawsuit of Bay Area Clean Air against Lehigh Cement and Santa Clara County. You have seen the data on the pollution from Lehigh Cement plant. You have seen a record of their refusal to abide by the federal and state pollution laws. for a decade or more. What I'd like you to do is to support BASE and no toxic air in this lawsuit in any way you can. As a minimum, I would like you to prepare an amicus brief in their behalf for their support. I have children and grandchildren living in the area. They breathe the same air that we all do, and I'm very concerned about this air pollution problem. And so if you could please consider that, I would appreciate it. Thank you much.
Thank you. Jeff Rangel? R-A-N-G-E-L, first name Jeff. We just call him as I see him. Just sort of have to be fast on your feet here.
We're going to dance, and it's going to be wonderful. Good evening. My name is Jeff Rangel. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs with Brocade, and I'm delighted to share some information with you about the Turkey Trot. Carl Gordino will also speak to that. But I'm here to encourage you to participate in the Mayor's Cup. This year, the Mayor's Cup of the Turkey Trot will give you an opportunity to compete with your local city colleagues and take perhaps the gold trophy home. Last year, if we were the Olympics, you would have received the bronze based on your participation. Councilmember, we appreciate you doing that. But basically, for your participation, Mayor, Vice Mayor, council members, and city staff, city manager and planning commissioners, you receive points based on your registration. And based on those points that you achieve towards your goal, you have opportunity to receive the Mayor's Cup. Brocade really thinks that this is a great opportunity to show your support of community activities, to engage in friendly competition with your local city colleagues, and have some spirited fun that really goes to benefiting three great organizations that Carl will speak to in just a moment. So we encourage you to participate in that. I come out every year with my family. It's a great opportunity to get some exercise, have some fun, but again, really engage in that public-private partnership that allows you to compete with your local colleagues. You'll be competing with other small cities such as Belmont, Burlingame, East Palo Alto, Foster City, Los Altos, Los Gatos, and Menlo Park. Saratoga also competes, and they've actually won this trophy a few years in a row, and we think you've got a great opportunity to take that from them and display it outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Carl Gordino.
Mayor Spector, nice to see you, and members of the Town Council. Thank you for making time for us again this year. It was 9 years ago that you allowed me to stand before you as my wife Leslie and I announced that we were forming through the Silicon Valley Leadership Group Foundation a new charity community event called the Applied Materials Silicon Valley Turkey Trot, and you trusted us. That first year we were able to bring together 1,900 people from across the region for an inaugural run of that Turkey Trot. We were able to raise and contribute $80,000 to Second Harvest Food Bank, the Healthy Kids Foundation, and the Housing Trust of Santa Clara County. And it was a great start. Last year, 8 years later, we've grown that race from 1,900 participants to last year 24,244, surpassing Detroit as the largest Thanksgiving weekend run in the United States. And since it's a holiday only really celebrated in the United States, the biggest Thanksgiving run really in the galaxy. We do this with your support, and we are hoping that, as you have so graciously done in past years, that you'll not only come out individually to support it and to register in the Brocade Mayor's Cup, but as Greg Larson on your team and his staff have done so ably for you, to place your flyers, our flyers and posters in and around Town Hall. Thank you again for all you do for the community. Our 8-year total, we've donated more than $3 million to those three charities. We've added the Food Bank of Santa Cruz County this year as well, that serves 52,000 of their 270,000 residents in that small county. And with your help, we will be able to contribute $850,000 this year, bringing our 9-year total to $4 million contributed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim Brand. And I have no other cards, so if you want to speak on verbal communications, please submit a card to the clerk.
Good evening. My name is Tim Brand. I'm also with the Bay Area for Clean Environment, and I'd like to encourage you to support our group with an amicus brief. In February of 2011, the County Board of Supervisors held a hearing to determine the extent of Lehigh Cement's vested mining rights. The county staff spent many months preparing an exhaustive legal and historical analysis and recommended the board grant Lehigh vested rights for a limited portion of their property. And we felt the staff did an admirable and professional job, and we substantially agreed with their balanced recommendations. Despite specific flaws, if the staff recommendations had been implemented, the vested rights issue would have been settled on that day. Instead, the county board ignored the staff recommendation and granted sweeping vested rights. And I have a map here. Can we turn this on quickly? And there's one particular spot on this map that I'll show you, and I have a quote from the county staff regarding that particular area where Lehigh had built an illegal waste dump over a period of 5 or 6 years. And so they had kind of a problem, because if it wasn't going to get vested, they were going to have a hard time getting it approved. But the county granted them that land, even though they didn't own it at the time the zoning ordinance was put in place. And this is a quote from the county. It says, with respect to the East Materials storage area, the county geologist did not identify any quarrying-related disturbances as of 1948. Moreover, this land was sold to a separate corporation and developed intensively for metals manufacturing. And it ends by saying, thus, any legal non-conforming use that may have been established on the proposed EMSA East Material Storage Area land was abandoned long ago. But they got that land anyway. So you can see on this map, this area in the middle. Oh, it doesn't work that way. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. I think I can do it from here. So there's an area that's outlined in the center of that map. It's kind of colored violet and blue. And that is an outline of all the areas that the county recommended Lehigh be granted vested rights on. And the area that's outlined in black magic marker around the outside is the area that the county board granted them. Very arbitrary. And all you have to do is maybe look at a Google map and look at the great big brown swath that's about 3 miles long and about a mile wide. And much of that was supposed to be reclaimed according to the 1985 reclamation plan, and it hasn't been to this day. So we're very worried that now that they don't even need a permit, so that the public and the county can put conditions on their permit, they're going to be able to expand much more easily. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to address us on verbal communications? As I said, I have no other cards. Seeing no one coming forward, we will move on to public hearings. We have one public hearing this evening, Agenda Item 9, Zoning Code Amendment A1301, Firearm Regulation. The applicant is the Town of Los Gatos. Before the council are the following. A, an ordinance adopting amendments to Chapter 29 zoning regulations of the Town Code regarding the 1, retail sales of firearms, ammunition, and/or destructive devices, 2, home occupation permits, and 3, duties of the Planning Commission and Town Council. B, an ordinance repealing the portion of the Town Code Section 18.70.015 that allows the discharging of firearms on private property, and C, a resolution establishing a fee for the firearms dealer permit. If I understand correctly, Ms. Bailey, you will be making the staff report. Community Development Director Sandy Bailey, and I would request if we do have desk items, if you could just briefly let us and the public know what desk items we have on this. Thank you.
Okay, yes, there is a desk item on this matter. The desk item includes the additional public correspondences the town received regarding this matter, and it also includes response to council and public inquiries. And at the end of my presentation, if you have any specific questions or clarifications regarding the desk item, I can go into that for you. There we go. At the Town Council meeting of March 4th, 2013, Town Council adopted an urgency ordinance establishing a temporary moratorium on the opening of any new business engaged in the retail sales of firearms, ammunition, and/or explosive devices within the town of Los Gatos. And to summarize those uses, I'm just going to refer to them as firearms. I'm not going to use that whole term there through the rest of my presentation. The council extended the moratorium on April 15th, and the moratorium is still in effect until February 20th of 2014. The mayor appointed 2 council members to an ad hoc subcommittee to work with staff on the language for an ordinance to establish a regulatory business permit process for firearm sellers in the town of Los Gatos, which was adopted by the Town Council on August 5th of 2013. In addition, the Council Ad Hoc Subcommittee was also directed to work with town staff to develop zoning and land use regulations for firearm sellers. The report you have before you tonight contains the recommendations made by the committee and the Planning Commission. The intent of the proposed amendments and what is before you tonight for consideration are as follows. In regards to the zoning ordinance, Council will be considering designating a zoning district where retail sales of firearms is permitted with the approval of a conditional use permit, establishing regulations for a conditional use permit for retail sales of firearms, prohibiting the sales of firearms for home occupation permits, incorporating existing town policies regarding home occupation permits and the duties and responsibilities of the Planning Commission and Town Council, and the time limits for existing uses. In addition, Council will be considering repealing a section of the Town Code which is not in the zoning ordinance, which deals with discharging of firearms on private property. And Council will also be considering establishing a fee for a firearms dealer's permit. And for clarification, that fee for the permit was recently established for the regulatory process of firearms, and it is not related at all to the conditional use permit process. In regards to the zoning district, prior to the adoption of the moratorium, retail firearm sales were permitted in 4 commercial zones that allowed retail sales. The Council Ad Hoc Committee reviewed each of these zones, and they also reviewed 1 other zone. Of the 5 zones reviewed, the committee first determined that the LM and the CM zones were the best zones to allow the use, since each encompassed an industrial area and it would have minimal impact on residential neighborhoods. The committee then analyzed LM and CM zone parcels that were located outside of a 500 and a 250-foot buffer radius of sensitive uses. And these sensitive uses included schools, educational facilities, public parks and trails, government buildings, religious institutions, and existing youth-oriented facilities. And those types of facilities are like dance and karate studios. In addition, the committee also considered the locations of the safe route to schools. Because no parcels in the CM zone were outside either of the buffer radiuses, the committee eliminated the CM zone as a possible location, and the committee recommends that the use be permitted only in the LM zone with approval of a conditional use permit. In the LM zone, no parcels were outside the 500-foot buffer radius. Therefore, the committee is recommending a 250-foot buffer radius. This slide, which is attachment 9 in your report, illustrates the recommended buffer area and what parcels are eligible to apply for a conditional use permit for retail firearm sales. Based on the recommended language in your report detailing the method used to measure distances from building walls of a potential retail space, additional retail spaces on other parcels not shown on the map may be available for retail firearm sales. And so some of those parcels would be that are in the black outline area that are white, where the parcel is located within the buffer area, but there may be tenant spaces within those parcels that are located outside the buffer area. So there are some potential properties where additional tenant spaces could be available. In regards to home occupation permits, pursuant to Town Council direction, the sales of firearms is proposed to be prohibited home occupation use. Since prohibited home occupation uses are proposed to be added in the zoning ordinance, staff is taking an opportunity to incorporate in the zoning ordinance amendments additional prohibited uses which are currently prohibited under a town planning department policy, which became effective in 1996. And these uses are income tax repairers, medical offices and uses, real estate office, and contractor and contracting services where they have crews that show up on the site or where they store construction materials that are unrelated to a typical homeowner use. In case you are questioning why we prohibit tax preparers and real estate offices as home occupation permits, that is because the town code requires only one customer at a time for home occupation permits. And it was determined that couples typically need to go to a tax preparer or to a real estate office. And so that is why the policy was adopted. In regards to firearm land use regulations, I'm not going to go into the details because there's a lot, but to summarize the regulations described in your report, there are findings for denial, considerations, conditions of approval, operating standards, and noticing requirements, which are recommended to be part of the conditional use permit process. Changes are also proposed to the duties of the Planning Commission and the Town Council regarding conditional use permits for retail firearm sales and to incorporate current requirements for establishments that sell alcoholic beverage for on-site consumption. And lastly, we'll be discussing existing uses. In regards to options for existing uses, if the proposed zoning ordinance amendments are adopted, any existing retail seller of firearms that was legally operating as of the effective date of the ordinance, it would become a non-conforming use. Currently, Town Code permits non-conforming, non-residential uses in the downtown area to continue in perpetuity if the use became non-conforming due to zone changes and zoning ordinance amendments, which occurred after July 1st, 1982. Town Code requires other uses to cease after a specific duration if they cannot come into conformance with the current zoning requirements. The Council Ad Hoc Subcommittee is proposing 3 options regarding the time limits for nonconforming uses, and those are listed on the slide. The options are status quo, not making any change, requiring a specific period of time, or requiring a specific time of 60 days, which may be currently required by the zoning ordinance for uses that are located outside the downtown area. Just a note, previously Town Council has adopted by ordinance to exclude various existing uses from the 60-day requirement. That would be things like new office buildings and formula retail. The Town Code incorporates language in the zoning ordinance that the amendment regarding the use only applies to new uses after the effective date of the ordinance. It doesn't like me. There we go. The Planning Commission considered the zoning ordinance amendments on August 28th of this year, and the comments made at this meeting are summarized in your report. The Commission recommended adoption of the zoning ordinance amendments as proposed by the Council Ad Hoc Subcommittee. In regards to existing uses, some of the commissioners thought that a 60-day period was too short and that a 20-year compliance period was too long. The other considerations before you tonight is to repeal a section of the Town Code regarding the exceptions when someone can discharge a firearm. The current code, and this is not in the zoning ordinance, allows the discharging of firearms on private property which contains 5 acres or more. It is recommended that this section be repealed due to a public safety concern. And staff is also bringing forward, is also recommending the adoption of a new fee that would be considered in the spring 2014 budget. Staff is making a recommendation for the permit review at that time. So we're anticipating that once Templar has obtained their business permit, well, at that time we'll have a clearer representation of what the cost is to process that permit. So I'm going back to what Council will be considering tonight. So I have 2 slides that's to help move you along in the discussion process. It's again going over the items, and so this deals with the zoning ordinance requirements And this deals with the other town code amendment and the fee for the regulatory permit process. And that includes staff's report. I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Bailey? Are you raising your hand, Ms. Jensen? Oh, she's showing Ms. McNutt's raising her hand. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. In a lot of the pages of desk item that we received today, and in reading through that, I would like staff to go through on the timing options a little bit more detail, because especially for the public, because I think in the quick overview it made it sound as if we have 3 choices, just check off a box of which one we want. My understanding from reading through the desk item is that there are a lot of legal parameters around each one of those that limits or guides what we can do. So could we have a real clear explanation of that before we get into public comment?
In the town code, there are several sections that deal with different amortization periods. The one that I had referenced, it deals with non-residential uses in the downtown area. Those uses would be allowed to continue in perpetuity, so that would be one option. There's another option where there's a 20-year amortization period. The town has used that when there was a major town code amendment. I believe it was in the late 70s, when the town code went through a major amendment where use permits were required for restaurants, service stations, banks. So they had a 20-year amortization period for people to apply for a conditional use permit. And new properties that annex into the town, those are also subject to the 20-year amortization. And the other one is there's a 60-day period for businesses that are not in the downtown area, and staff is not aware of any use that was required to meet that 60-day requirement. And there's other uses if you're a junkyard, and depending on what type of permits were approved for that site, there's some other issues or other sections of the code that deal with those. Does that clarify your question?
Only partially, because again, as I'm reading it, as I'm trying to understand staff's commentary on this, the code says that if the property is in downtown, which this is, then it is in perpetuity. If it's not in downtown, then these other possibilities are aware. So I'm trying to figure out, again, it's sounding like we have quite a few easy options to us, and I think there was reference to zoning amendments, general plan amendments, things that would have to be taken under action if we wanted to move away from what's actually in town code. So that's what I was looking for, is a little bit more explanation, again, for the public, that it's not choose option A, B, or C. There's stuff that goes along with each one of those that is complex and complicated.
So if there was no changes regarding an amortization period, if the code was left as is, but an ordinance was adopted to require a conditional use permit for retail firearm sales, then the existing use would be allowed to continue in perpetuity based on current town code requirements. Town council has the option to, what staff would recommend if they wanted to create an amortization period, would be to add a section specifically for firearm sales, as the town code has for like junkyards, where there's a different specified period of time. If council made an interpretation that the downtown area is not as defined by staff, which actually that's not defined by staff, as defined by the general plan and the town code, those would require zoning ordinance amendments and town code amendments, and there are serious ramifications in that the downtown specific plan was created to mitigate nonconforming uses and nonconforming parking situations. And there were town code amendments specifically for the large downtown area. There's special parking requirements for those areas. So all the properties in the parking in the downtown area that we've included as an attachment in your map, those all parking was based on the downtown parking requirements. So if it was determined that only the C2 zone was the downtown area, that would make every other use outside of the downtown area up to Blossom Hill Road, up along Los Gatos Boulevard, non-conforming as to parking. And also that would implicate the town's parking assessment district because the formulas used were based on the downtown parking requirements. So there would be some serious ramifications if the definition of downtown was changed to the C2 zone.
Further questions, Ms. McNutt? Mr. Larson, further answers?
We'll see how the discussions and public comment go.
Okay, further, Ms. Jensen.
I have a series of questions regarding basically the same item. So I think perhaps anticipating what Mr. Larson wants to talk about, your December 7th email, in which you stated, quote, retail enterprises are allowed as a matter of legal right under existing zoning at that location, comma, which is not in the central business district, paren, i.e., comma, downtown. Why is it that we cannot rely on your expert opinion as to what downtown is, given that you're aware of the various definitions?
That was the first email in response to public comment about the firearms situation in Los Gatos. As explained in the desk item, the statement was accurate that Templar was not in the central business district, and we use the that is just to indicate kind of that's the common definition of downtown. No email from myself, from any member of staff, or even from the council can in any way supersede what the zoning code or the general plan says.
Follow-up? To Ms. Prop, in our desk item, you indicated that it was important to note that the town zoning ordinance defines the central business district as the area of the downtown which is zoned C2. The area that we're contemplating zoning for and the area where the existing firearms retailer is LM, as I understand it. So how does a definition of downtown as C2 create a downtown definition for LM?
I didn't prepare the desk item, and since that
okay,
is
I guess this was an email
question, I'll defer to Ms. Bailey at this time.
Okay.
And the first part of your question was the definition of the central business district, or was it the downtown definition?
Zoning ordinance that indicates that the definition of the central business district, I can't speak tonight. The central business district defines it as downtown, which is zone C2.
Right, it's the portion of the downtown area that is zone C2. So it's just commenting that it's a portion of the downtown area. It doesn't define that that is the downtown area.
Okay, so it just strikes me that there's several different definitions. I wanted to ask Ms. Prop about our existing non-conforming use statute that was referred to in Ms. Bailey's answer. It's 29.10.195. Paren B, Paren 4, is what I'm specifically interested, which has the 60-day period. So as I read that ordinance, there's an A paragraph, and this is for Ms. Bailey or Ms. Prop, who's ever appropriate, and that sets out amortization periods which are specifically related to areas. So the first one is downtown, and it seems to me that the definition of that is amorphous at best. Then there is a 20-year period, which doesn't seem to be particularly tied to an area. But then if I go to the B section, those aren't tied to a zone at all. They are specific uses. For example, junkyard, 90 days, whatever else. And so my question is, why isn't B4 specifically applicable? Because it doesn't refer to a zone or an area. It makes it puts a time limit on a use that becomes non-conforming only because a CUP would be required that's passed after July 1981. It's not related to a particular district. So why is it not applicable in this case?
So I'll start, and then Ms. Bailey can respond on any of the technical
And
zoning.
before you start, you were looking at 2920.
Yeah, for reference, it would be on page 5 of our staff report. At the top of the page starts with paragraph B, and I'm.
And just give me the code section. I'll go to that.
It's laid out actually in the staff report. So the code section is 29.10.195, paren B, paren 4.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Ms. Prop.
And just for clarification, that the code sections were also attached to the desk item for your easy reference this evening. With respect to 2910.195, as Councilmember Jensen points out, subsection A does talk about specific uses, and staff has interpreted A4 as non-residential uses in the downtown, which would otherwise be non-conforming due to a zone change and ordinance amendments, which occurred after July 1, 1982, applicable to the existing firearms retailer, in that the general plan includes a definition of what downtown is, and that's supported by the map that was attached as an exhibit to your staff report, Exhibit A to Attachment 8, that clearly shows the downtown area as defined by the town general plan and the zoning code. However, moving to your questions to 2910.195B, again, it's not only B4, but council might want to also, your attention is called to B3. So as Councilmember Johnson points out, B1 speaks to a specific use. B2, where there's land, where there are improvements on land, doesn't apply to any of the existing firearms retailers. What many of the uses in the town have fallen into is this B3 that Ms. Bailey referred to as applicable when town adopted a town-wide zoning changes, where the land is improved with one or more structure of a type for which a building permit would currently be required, and the structures are utilized in connection with the non-conforming use. Non-conforming uses shall cease 20 years from March 23rd, 1966, or 20 years from the date that the use became non-conforming, which is ever later. So for the most part, the town has applied B3 when none of the specific conditions of subsection A 1 through 7 have been applied. In looking at and researching B4, which is a 60-day, planning staff has not been able to identify that town has applied that to any existing uses that they're aware of, and they've done some historical changes. We're not aware of why that would apply to the existing firearms retail use in this situation. If council finds some determination that the existing property isn't in the downtown and A4 doesn't apply, then staff would suggest that council should look at all of the options in subsection B.
Ms. Jensen? Ms. McNutt?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, because I think it's becoming clear to me, more clear, on this downtown business. So let me make a statement and see if it's correct, and you tell me if I'm on the right track, okay? So when, according to the general plan, we define downtown as a geographic area bounded by certain streets. It's not a zone, it's a geographic area. And within that geographic area, there's C2, which is what we usually refer to as the downtown, which is, you know, our little streets up here with the shops. There's LM, there's some residential, there's some other zones within that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I got it. Thank you.
Further questions? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Question for Ms. Bailey. Has the town ever abated part of a business? For instance, in the report, it said something to the effect where in 1996, the council sought merit in not having gas stations sell liquor within a certain distance of schools. And I guess those gas stations are still in existence, but the alcohol being sold has been taken away, so not their complete business was abated. What time frame were they given during that period? Is there any information on that?
I'd have to research that, but I don't recall that any gas stations had to cease operation, and I'm not familiar that any stations had to comply with getting a CUP, because I don't ever recall seeing them on our non-conforming status list. So either none existed and maybe one was coming in that triggered that requirement. And so I don't have any further more information on that one.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Jensen.
One final question. I guess this is for Ms. Prop. If it is the case that the town has not used a particular section of its code, does that render that section invalid?
No.
I'm going to switch gears. I have some questions. We're going to go away from amortization for a while. If I understand the staff report correctly, we may have gun sales from residences, from homes, but we have no legal ones. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I seem to recall the staff report saying that staff would be looking from direction from the council as to how to or when the process for initiating enforcement. So why wouldn't staff just enforce it? Why is there a need for the council to come up with some direction?
That would be up to council for direction. Since there are no conforming home occupation permits, staff does not feel there is a need to set an amortization for home occupation uses. Because if the town did find one after the ordinance is adopted, then we would be proactive in making them come into compliance.
All right. Okay. So that's what I misunderstood. I thought the staff report was saying that guns are being sold from homes.
And we actually don't know if they are being sold from homes. We just know some businesses still have an active FFL license, and they have requested that their home occupation permit be rescinded because they're not doing the business anymore. But the FFL license is still in effect because it's in effect for a certain period of time. We are not actually aware that anyone I don't think we're aware of anyone selling guns from their home in the town limits.
Mr. Larson?
I believe there's two parts in answering this question. One is we have previously provided the council in prior discussions a list of the FFLs that are in the town of Los Gatos. If I remember correctly, there were 2 or 3 that were in residential locations. One of those I remember explicitly, police department contacted in December of last year or January and asked them their status, and they told us that they were not renewing their business license because they were ceasing operations. However, FFLs are granted for a 3-year period, so that continued. So as far as we know, there is no gun sales occurring at that residence. Further, as the council may recall from prior code enforcement discussions, unless directed otherwise by council, code enforcement is done on a complaint basis. We have not received complaints of gun sales at that location, so there has been no precipitating action to cause staff to go investigate further. So we have no knowledge that gun sales are occurring there, but the council could always change that direction.
All right. The $4,000 recommendation that is coming from staff for processing the permit, is that the initial permit from the retail firearm retail seller?
Yes, that's the initial regulatory permit fee.
And was that based upon staff's experience with the time and effort expended?
Yes, we have a fee already calculated for when we send things to the town council, so it's consistent with that fee, as well as the addition of the police department being part of that review process.
Mr. Larson?
And I might add, as explained in the staff report in response to council and public discussion, the regulatory permit process that you previously approved specifically stated it would be a public hearing process. So what CDD used in estimating their cost was equivalent public hearing processes that would be used. Then police, not having a comparable process, added an increment that they thought was a reasonable estimation of what their costs would be. And then there was a final de minimis amount for town manager, town attorney's office added that came to the $4,000. Obviously, that fee is evaluated every year, and if we find that is high or low when we do the next fee study, it would be adjusted at that time.
With regard to the firearm retailer's business license, is the amount of that license predicated on projected sales, retail sales?
Correct. There's 3 different processes under the construct that's before council that a firearms retailer would go through at the town of Los Gatos. One is the regulatory permit that we just talked about. Second is the potential conditional use permit process, which the council will be deciding upon tonight. And the third that has always existed in recent times and was paid by the incumbent firearms retailer is a business license fee. That's not a regulatory permit. It's like a fishing license. You pay the fee, you get the license. It's not a discretionary act by the town. And that fee for retailers is a sliding scale fee based on the volume of retail sales, but it has a cap of approximately $950 as the business license fee at the top of the retail sales level, because retailers also pay sales tax, and the town receives a portion of that.
In the case of Templar, do you recall what the amount of the business license fee was and what type of retail sales it was predicated upon?
That is confidential information. Individual retail sales by individual sales taxpayers is proprietary information and cannot be released unless without the permission of the retailer.
And it's proprietary to town staff?
It is proprietary as part of our tax collection and review process.
If the mayor would allow me,
Certainly.
state law actually addresses that for the taxes and sales tax as well as license tax, is that state law doesn't allow us to distribute that information, and and the city has to have designated people like a finance director or such that is authorized to receive that information and audit it.
All right, thank you. On your, on staff's Exhibit 3, which is your proposed ordinance, on page 4, sub 2, it says the town council shall conduct annual reviews of the CUP, conditional use permit, for compliance. Would we be looking for compliance with the conditions? Would we be looking for compliance with the findings that were made to give the CUP? Both? Something else?
Typically, compliance would be with the conditions of approval, because the findings would have already been made regarding the other uses.
And you say typically, would it be necessarily limited to the conditions as opposed to the findings?
If there were issues that were brought up about the operation where it was a public health or safety concern, something that was generating a concern of the commission or council, that could potentially be part of a discussion, but it couldn't be in deals with the compliance. That would when you'd have to go through that potential modification and revocation process.
Okay. And then I only have one more question. With regard to the map that you had up there, where there was precluded and areas for firearm sales and in places where they could be sold, if a sensitive use moves, i.e., it's the LM zone, and right now there is a child's dance studio, and that dance studio moves, and so then the lot has 250 feet or more. If the sensitive use moves, does that make it possible that there could be an additional site for firearm sales?
I thought the question was going to go somewhere else, but yes, if it relocates outside of the area, then yes, then that would then potentially increase the parcels that were available.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As one of the members of the ad hoc committee, I want to clarify just a couple of things in relationship to the legal issues we're looking at here. At this point, given the processes that the subject property has gone through, it is currently a legal conforming business. Is it not correct?
That is correct.
All right. And it only would become something else if we were to initiate ordinance language or approve ordinance language that would then move it into the non-conforming status.
Correct. If you required a conditional use permit for that type of use, then yes, it would make it non-conforming.
All right. And then from the perspective of how we define downtown or central business district, I think that it's really clear we go back to the general plan to find the definition of downtown. I understand that there has been some mixing of the terminology, but the general plan calls out the downtown as outlined in that exhibit, and then the CBD has been defined as long as I can remember as nothing north of Highway 9, with some very specific properties designated south of Highway 9 that are considered the central business district with special definitions of what we expect to occur within that area. So for me, that's not a confusion. The question I guess I'd like to ask is, given the number of sensitive receptors, those particular characteristics of businesses that we are attempting to protect, from the schools all the way down to businesses primarily serving individuals under 18 years of age. Those are in some ways parallel to other jurisdictions that have gone through a process to create ordinance language that contains this type of business, and some go beyond. Are there any questions that you have regarding the specific individual designations that were recommended that you see problematic, given the fact that we have a fairly lengthy list of those categories that we're attempting to exclude?
I think the ad hoc committee did a good job in defining those uses. So as drafted, it can work.
Is there anything we're required to do to validate those particular uses as, in our consideration tonight?
As council moves through all of the issues that are before them, it is incumbent on council in this hearing, just like in any other land use public hearing, to articulate facts to support their positions, and to be able to make findings that support the reasons that those would be valid sensitive uses to protect the public welfare.
So it behooves us to then make sure that we do clarify or validate why we're choosing each of these particular categories. Is that not correct?
That would be recommended.
Thank you.
Good questions. Further questions? All right, we're finished at this juncture for now. And some of you have submitted cards. If other people want to discuss or speak to us on agenda item 9, please submit one of these cards to clerk. First person, Cynthia Chang, who will be followed by Deborah Weinstein. Ms. Chang?
Good evening, respectful town council members. My name is Cynthia Chen. I'm living in Saratoga, but I serve on the Los Gatos Saratoga High School District as a board member. I'm here just to share with you our board passed a resolution on April 30th of this year in support of the reduction of gun violence. So I will just cover some key points of that resolution. Our board is committed to providing a safe and healthy school environment within which to work and learn, and that all schools are free from violence of any kind. And our board also supports existing federal and state gun control legislation, including that which specifically addresses the prevention of gun ownership or gun use by those who, as determined by a qualified health practitioner, pose a danger to self or others. And our board supports the restoration within California of adequate mental health services funding, such that those suffering from mental illness are able to receive proper and timely diagnosis and treatment. Our board does not support the use of armed security guards or the arming of teachers and staff as a campus strategy. Lastly, our board will continue discussions with staff and community for the purpose of improving school community dialogues on matters of tolerance, conflict resolution, and creative problem solving. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, if anybody on the council has questions of the speakers, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Deborah Weinstein, who will be followed by Molly McConville.
My name is Deborah Weinstein. Hello,
I should know it by now, huh?
After all these months, come on. Hello, Town Council. First of all, I'd just really like to thank you, and specifically the ad hoc committee, for all of your time and your attention to this firearms ordinance. It takes a lot of courage and hard work to sit up here and do what you do, and I just want to thank you for that. Thank you for aligning yourself and your efforts with the other leaders in the state who've passed many important bills in the past week. And this brings me to the point of compliance with those regulations on the sale of firearms. We've had a lot of talk tonight about amortization already, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing I wanted to say. But as a community member, I feel the best practices regarding amortization would be to encourage the shortest time period possible. The goal would be to allow this non-conforming business to relocate to a zone where, in fact, it makes a better asset to our community as swiftly as possible. The amortization period should be based on code. We've already discussed what that code is. As the 60-day amortization period is currently what is in town code, it is presumptively reasonable to assume that this is in fact a legally reasonable period. In addition, there's rational basis for a quick amortization period as the benefit to the community outweighs any theoretical business losses. According to the urgency ordinance, which we passed on March 4th, whereas the sale of firearms, ammunition, and destructive devices has raised the following public health, safety, and welfare concerns: school safety, parks, school routes, and residents in close proximity to such sales. potential negative influences of such sales on children, and concerns and complaints about vandalism, protests, and threats related to the existing firearm dealer in Los Gatos. In addition, neighboring cities of Palo Alto and San Francisco have 60-day periods for compliance. Please lead our town, along with the state legislators, that we align our amortization periods in a way that protects our community. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Brzezinski.
Could I ask the staff to clarify that comparison to San Francisco and the other jurisdictions with the 60-day? How did that relate to what we're attempting tonight?
I don't know, we have the San Francisco one, but the city of Campbell and Palo Alto, I think Palo Alto had the 60-day amortization for the regulatory permit process, and I think Campbell had 90-day amortization for, again, the regulatory process.
So as stated in the desk item that was provided based on comments from the community before tonight's hearing, Campbell adopted a business regulatory permit, not a land use permit, and that is a 60-day compliance period, very similar to the regulatory business permit, firearms dealer permit that council adopted in August. And again, when we did a preliminary check regarding San Francisco, we were unable to find any land use restrictions that required amortization. And in fact, based on some of the comments from the community members before tonight's hearing, we've been unable in the survey that we conducted, as well as the survey that the city of Sunnyvale conducted a couple years ago for their council, to find any amortization periods for land use regulations for existing dealers that has been imposed. We're not saying there aren't any, we've just not been able to locate any.
All right, I appreciate that, but I just want to make sure that we are clear about the two categories that we're dealing with, and specifically what we decided in our previous restrictions for the permitting process versus what we're doing tonight with ordinance language.
To be clear, what Palo Alto and Campbell have done, Los Gatos has already done. What they did affected the business regulatory, and Town of Los Gatos has done that as well. Tonight before the council is the land use regulatory, which Palo Alto and Campbell, well, Campbell hasn't done at all, and Palo Alto has done a limited portion of.
All right, thank you both. Molly McConville, who will be followed by Henry Fee.
Hi, I'm Molly McConville. I haven't been to a meeting before. I've been wanting to come. And I live with my son on Farley West, and I'm not happy about the gun store being close to me where it is located now, and I would hate to see it move even closer into that industrial zone where I live, which is right on the corner from Shelbourne. So I'm just trying to understand the zoning and the maps and everything, and I just wanted to add my opinion.
Thank you. Henry Fee, who will be followed by Robert McCartney.
So this morning, most of us probably woke up to that tragic story, and reminds us again that the semi-automatic seems to be a weapon of choice. Semi-automatic, that you can get the parts on the web, even if you are ineligible to go to a gun store and buy it because of local or federal regulations. It is legal for you to buy it on the web. That's unconscionable. If it turns out that you're selling these parts without a commercial web license, it's probably criminal. But we're not here tonight to talk about that. What I wanted to talk about is the consideration that we're making all these rules and regulations, but the issue of compliance is a difficult one because there are rumors, somebody heard it, somebody didn't hear it. In a small town, there's the opportunity statistically for much more conflict of interest than in a large major city. Also, there may be a little apathy or inefficiency if it's an issue that's not close to your heart. So I would propose an amendment to our firearm regulations that says that a formal complaint presented in writing to the Planning Commission about firearm ordinances and non-compliance requires a hearing in 8 weeks when the Planning Commission has gathered the necessary evidence.
At that public hearing, if non-compliance is documented, then the business permit and the use permit are revoked. This is a one strike because we're not dealing with candy or we're not dealing with a restaurant or a gas station. We're talking not just health and safety, but we're actually talking very possibly the lives of the people that live in the area. So one strike and you're revoked. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question of staff. Right now, remind me what, if any, process do we have? What, if any, process is contemplated in the proposed ordinances before us?
I'll have to pull it up, but there's recommended conditions of approval as part of the ordinance amendments, and there is a yearly review for compliance with a notice of 500 feet, not 300.
I remember. Thank you. Robert McCartney, who will be followed by Shannon Susick.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and Council. As it happens, I'm speaking, I think, to second what Mr. Fee just said. It's recently come to my attention that at least where noise abatement is concerned, sometimes the complaint and response procedure is not optimal. And in the case of a store that sells firearms, there should be a very strict and a very reliable and a very transparent means for complaints to be immediately heard and resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. Shannon Susick, who will be followed by Michelle Van Zuyden.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm very proud of the process that led us here tonight. An alert and concerned group of Los Gatans organized last December to ask the question, why wasn't the public involved in the decision to open a firearms store in our town? Our mayor called for a public hearing and an emergency ordinance was created and ratified, and tonight we are finalizing the second phase of the language. And again, the public process brings us here to ensure that a solid document was created. Before the language is confirmed, it is most important that we make sure the public voice is integral in the ongoing regulatory process. And just now, a yearly review, there needs to be a more formal insertion into the ordinances of how the public can, how complaint can be filed and what the process is. Because there's been frustration trying to understand the community rights around the gun store operation. Several apparent violations have been brought up by Los Gatos citizens that have not been addressed. For example, parking. There's a broken window there still, that in a window that's supposed to be bulletproof. Web sales that are not transparent. And a myriad of land use regulations that have been tucked neatly under a non-conforming status. Last week, a request was made for copies of the e-commerce and manufacturing license, which is required by the town of Los Gatos if you're going to be selling things on the internet and manufacturing. No return call or email was made as promised by the town attorney. And within a few days, the website for Templar has been disabled. So I don't know if the town council is even aware of that. There's currently no website up any longer. We provided a group of documents tonight. Research should be done whether the town can restrict the sales of certain items that can be used to build automatic weapons and that have been advertised and sold on the internet by Templar, such as lower receivers. Regardless, there is a case support for increased taxes for firearms to assist in recouping the cost of additional support services that the town uses. We are counting on this ordinance to allow an ongoing, timely dialogue with the town staff, planning commission, and the chief of police. Simple edits of sections 2920, 190, 198, and 310 to include the word public or public hearing and written complaint would ensure this process is consistent. The efforts of the town council and the ad hoc committee members, Joe Przinski and Marcia Jensen, are applauded by all. The tragic events from this day in our nation's capital and the labors of our state lawmakers last week support the town of Los Gatos on this momentous evening. Rather than react in hindsight, as we've had to do this past year, let's let us remain on the forefront and proceed with foresight that protects the citizens of this town. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Van Zuyden, and then she will be followed by Michael Glow.
Good evening, Town Council members. I also want to thank you for your hard work on the new land zoning ordinance for the retail sales of firearms in Los Gatos. I serve as a school board trustee for Los Gatos Saratoga High School, and I wanted to let you know that I'm still concerned about the safe routes to school. As I understand in correspondence with Sandy Bailey from the planning staff, that the Parks and Public Works Department of Los Gatos is the actual develops what the routes are, the safe routes to schools, and that the ad hoc subcommittee's preliminary analysis reviewed these safe routes to school, but in the final discussion, these routes were not able to be considered in the final zoning recommendations. I'm most concerned about the 606 University parcel that's designated as one of the 3 potential sites for retail gun sales, as this is a route that many children use to go to Fisher, to Vasona Park, and to Los Gatos High School, as well as other schools in the area. I'm not as concerned with the 2 parcels on Shoreborn, only because there are convenient alternative safe routes to school for our students on Farley Road West, for students who go to Nova, Daves Avenue, or Fisher Middle School. Last week, as you probably know, the town of Los Gatos, in collaboration with all of the K through 12 schools, sponsored a successful Safe Routes to School week. So let's continue in the spirit of this week and continue to improve the town's safe routes to school and efforts to promote walking and biking within a collaborative community framework. Thank you.
Michael Glow will be followed by David Burt.
Hi. I haven't gotten any prepared statements, so this is going to be a little bit of rambling, so bear with me. My question is in regard to when this issue blew up, there was many citizens come up here before the council indicating a concern for incompetence, if not outright corruption, regarding how this gun shop got into town. So just in through the back door somehow. So my question is, there was a request for an investigation. I have seen nothing to the effect that there has been an investigation initiated. Maybe there has, and I don't know if there was such an investigation, who would be the appropriate party to conduct it, whether it be the ATF or the county sheriff. I have no idea. So I'm here more for a civic lesson, looking for feedback regarding how this process would occur if it did occur, and if it doesn't occur, who has the power on the council or in the town to ignore this kind of public outcry and let it fall on deaf ears and never any follow-up or feedback as far as any repercussion or action taken? Thank you.
Thank you. David Burt, and then Ryan Reed.
Madam Mayor, thank you. Council, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I grew up in this town. I attended Daves Avenue School, Van Meter, Fisher, Los Gatos High School. I live in this town. I work in this town. I have 3 children that I've raised in this town. I am coached youth sports, both boys and girls. I consider myself embedded in this town. I'm also a member of a service club in this town. And I care greatly and deeply for the welfare of this town. I have a great concern regarding the rezoning ordinance that's been brought up regarding Templar Sports. And my concern for that is that this store was allowed to operate and approved last year, July and August. And it seems that now in the 11th hour, there appears to be minority public outcry to change that, to require them to move, relocate, and I have a real issue with that. My issue is that this will be fought, and it will be fought at public expense. Your dollars, our dollars, taxpayers' dollars. And it will be deep, and it will go long, and I really don't think it's a fight that we want to take on, or a fight that can be won. Decisions were made a year ago to approve this town, or to approve this store to operate, and I just don't think that it's a battle that we want to take on and can win. Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan Reed, who will be followed by Ben Cogan.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you for your concern for the gun store that is in our wonderful town. And I would like to ask you to please respect all of the parents here and all the kids here, because apparently the concern here is, walking to school, man, it's going to be really dangerous. There's a gun store. But really, it's up to the parents here. I ask you to respect them and let them teach their children about gun safety, and to tell them, don't walk over there, okay? You can look down in East Side San Jose. I myself, I will not walk down there by myself, because I have friends who've been shot and stabbed, and I have an uncle in Richmond who's been shot twice. One in his store where he works, and one a stray bullet in his when he was in his living room. So really, it's not about zoning. It's not about what it is. It's about education, and really, it's up to us to protect ourselves. It takes how long for a cop car to get to someone's house? Are you going to ask the murderer to, hey, wait, there's a cop on his way to stop you, okay? No. It's up to us. And please stop killing our economy here. The more laws that there are, it just shows how more corrupt the society is getting. Okay? Saratoga, all you got down there is, a couple clothing shops? And we have a bajillion salons here fighting after parking spots. What is really the concern? There's drug farms and meth labs down from one of my friend's houses up in the mountains, a meth lab. And you guys aren't doing anything about it because it's zoning, or, there's a lot of things that are being overlooked. And just to have an honest group of men and women who want to protect themselves and to earn a living, and there's a person who owns part of the business in Templar, who is one of our own people to protect us. He's a police officer.
Mr. Reed, would you direct your statements to us, please?
Yes. So, would you please consider just letting them go with their business and be able to prosper or fail? Let the economy decide? Not a rhetorical question. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ben Cogan, followed by Lisa Mamel. And that's the last card I have.
Well, hello again. I know you guys all know me. I heard you guys have another meeting. I wanted to be part of it. Thank you, respected Barbara Spector and council. Thank you for letting us be here. Conversation that will be talking from decades and decades and times to come. And it's going to be the freedom of humanity and the Constitution and the Second Amendment. Now, I understand Templar Sports came in. There's some people that don't like it. There's always going to be people that don't like things. I don't like stretchy pants in Safeway. It's uncomfortable when I buy food, but that's a whole different story. The point is you're not going to make everyone happy. And let's say Templar Sports, because I don't know the whole story. Maybe you were here and you didn't realize what they were doing. Okay, so there's an outcry. So if you want to address Templar Sports, address Templar Sports. To put laws and rules on the books to prevent this from happening again would be an atrocity and a crime and against freedom as well. And just like my friend was saying, you have to be 18 or older to buy a gun. You have to wait 10 days. You have to go through a background check. It's not like any geek off the street's going to just go and get one. There's state laws and federal laws as well, which Templar has complied with. So I look to you guys to listen to the people and be a beacon of light. And maybe you understand Los Gatos, but I'm asking you from the bottom of my heart, do not make it so there can't be another gun store at all. It's a freedom and a basic right. If someone can sell a muffin or a banana or a smoothie, they can sell a gun. It's the Second Amendment right. The media is going to push to get rid of guns and push it so we will be disarmed. And just keep in mind the reason why guns exist in this country is to prevent tyranny, to prevent other countries from attacking, to prevent our own government from going out of control. And you know, Los Gatos may not need a gun store because there will be gun stores other ways. But if gun stores cease to exist, what will happen is the criminals will have the guns and their gun stores will flourish. And so you should allow the citizens of Los Gatos to be able to defend the children of Los Gatos by living in Los Gatos and protecting themselves. And I just hope that that's where your motivation lies, and I hope that that's what you want to see. And I really hope that you, council, respected council, can make your own decisions and not have to deal with the state pushing stuff down your throat. I don't know what it's like in your position. I would love to be in your position. Maybe one day we can work together. But you know, the Second Amendment, is to keep all you guys safe. It's to stop tyranny, and you know, Templar Sports hasn't done anything wrong. There's not going to be everyone that likes everything, but there's been a lot of support for Templar Sports. If they did everything right, don't try and zone them out of existence. Please don't. Be a beacon of light. Stand for Los Gatos. Stand for America. Appreciate it. Stand for the Second Amendment.
Thank you. Lisa Mammal. I'm going to ask, that's once. We don't have clapping because it slows down our process. Have to ask a second time. We'll have everybody except the council outside. Lisa, and she will be followed by Julie Maya.
Thank you. Thanks especially to the ad hoc committee for the long time and the research that the ordinance represent. I truly believe that this is hope, this is a light, especially in the dark events of today's shooting in Washington, D.C. I've submitted my statement to the Town Council with regard to timing for compliance by existing businesses and my request for clear and meaningful avenues for public participation in the process of licensing and permitting and compliance of firearms dealers to operate in Los Gatos. Given some of the discussion by the council members tonight, I choose to focus on timing and as well as on sensitive receptors. The timing for conformance of an existing business at this time, there are two, perhaps, inaccuracies offered in the report tonight. Page 5, number 3, contrary to the staff report, Campbell does indeed have an amortization for an existing use, and it does indeed pertain to zoning. Campbell's compliance is 545130. A person engaged in the business of selling, leasing, or otherwise transferring a firearm component or ammunition on the effective date of this chapter shall, within 90 days of the effective date, comply with this chapter. And the zoning or location chapter that it is linked to, and it's again on this page or on this chapter, it pertains to zoning and location. It's 545080, and I'll spare you reading it. I will offer it up though. Palo Alto does indeed have an amortization period on existing businesses, and it does indeed pertain to zoning, and it is 57140, and it states, pardon me, well, I'm fumbling with the papers here, but long story short, it does have a 60-day period, and I can offer it up again. Section 4570509 is the within a zoning business in which the retail service is not permitted or conditional use. So again, it pertains to zoning and the location. With regard to the sensitive areas, I appreciate Mr. Krasinski's question as to whether there's a requirement for determining a sensitive receptor or that there has to be substantiation. I respond that the local municipality indeed has great latitude in determining what is a sensitive receptor. This was stated by the Supreme Court, of course, in Heller, and it was recently reaffirmed last week just in our backyard in the county of Alameda, a federal court opinion, which states the Supreme Court does not cast doubt on longstanding prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of firearms. The Supreme Court identified these sort of laws as presumptively lawful regulatory measures and emphasized that our list does not purport to be exhaustive. So indeed, there's great latitude. Thank you.
Before you have I need to follow up on a couple of things. Is it your testimony or understanding that Campbell enacted land use ordinances requiring a CUP and then gave existing businesses 90 days to comply?
I don't know the legislative history, and I'm not offering my opinion as a legal scholar. I can provide you the cohesive chapter that deals both with zoning and regulatory permits in the same chapter, and it states that they have a certain period to comply.
All right, and so
here's the full chapter.
My question would be the same with regard to Palo Alto, and I'm assuming you have 60 days there, and I'm assuming that you would just give us the materials.
I will, and I'd let you, as you're an attorney, I'll let you draw your conclusion, as you are all council members can draw your conclusions. I just prefer to read these to you and offer them up to you for your conclusion.
All right, thank you.
I'll also offer up there's a Supreme Court and the Alameda Court opinion of any interest. Okay.
You may give whatever you'd like to the clerk.
Thank you. They have notes on them. I didn't expect to have to pull them today.
Julia Maya, followed by Amy Goldsmith.
I'd like to thank you, the council, for putting all of this hard effort into the document that you are making a decision about today. You've done a magnificent job, and I hope that you continue with that. I'd like to tell you that I was so thrilled when I saw how many businesses are in the LM area that serve children, that are interested in exposing children to the arts, to ballet, to dance, to martial arts, to promoting children's healthy development of their bodies and a healthy sense of how important the arts are. And of course, Oak Meadow Park is right there, which serves children's imaginations, lets them play. And for those reasons, I'd like to say that you need, I think, to establish that the existing store needs to move to a different location. Something nobody else has mentioned, but I'd like to, is that Templar Sports knew full well that those existing businesses were there. They knew that they were moving in across the street from a ballet studio where children are taught. They knew that they are a block away from Oak Meadow Park. To pretend that they're facing some kind of horror that they could not have predicted is foolish, I think. They knew also that there is a citizens movement around the country and in municipalities and bodies like yours that are standing up against gun violence and saying we have to have limits. We have to have limits on where access to guns occurs. And for these reasons, for the children, I think that it only makes sense to have the 60-day strict amortization, and Templar should move. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, my last card, Amy Goldsmith.
Good evening, Town Council. Thank you. Thank you for all of the effort that you have put in so far. Thank you for your diligence. Thank you for explicating the things that were quite confusing to me also about the various locations in town and the various zones. Thank you also, staff, for your effort on this. It's a matter that means a lot to many of us. And we really appreciate your care and your effort. I would like to second, third, fourth, the statement that Mr. Fee made recently about the complaint process. I think that having a clear complaint process and time in which complaints would be answered would be useful for more than just this, actually. There are a number of things. It's nice to be able to get an answer from the town and to be able to have an idea how long it will be before you get a particular answer. So, Henry, I'd like to second that. Somebody else earlier said that we should let the economy decide. I don't agree with that. Part of the problem with, how do you complain, who do you complain to, especially when there are conflict of interest, especially like with one of our police officers associated with this store. It muddies the whole process. So I really appreciate the fact that you are deciding to lead and to align yourself with nonviolence. I spend all of my life, literally every day, almost every day, thinking about teaching children and helping them learn. And I like to be able to, in many ways, take for granted that they are safe so that I can focus on them as people and what they need, because my entire concentration is needed to do that well. And being able to assume the things that should be givens in this world, like that you are relatively safe, that, to me, it frees me to concentrate and to do the things that I can do well. Thank you for your help.
Thank you. I have no other cards. I don't see any with the clerk. See no one coming forward. I will close the public testimony portion of our hearing, and I will turn it to the council for questions of staff, discussion, or motion. Ms. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have two related questions regarding the public complaint process. The first is, would one of you hopefully confirm for me that in the regulatory permitting process that was just adopted, that there is a process for bringing complaints forward by Planning Commission, Town Council, members of the public, Chief of Police, Town Manager, etc.? Am I correct in that?
In reviewing the code section, section 14.130 that, et cetera, that council recently adopted, there are a couple provisions that provide for review and public process. There is the section .060 that talks about suspension or revocation of a permit and the basis for that. There's also an annual review. It's only a 1-year permit, and there are specific sections that require conditions, terms, and renewal. There is section on compliance and penalties for any violations. I'm not specifically locating a public process for a complaint from the community to come forward, but council's looking that in general on just general matters at this point.
That's
Before you go on, let me just get something, because it was a question. I thought that page 4, unless Ms. Jensen's question was somewhat different, I had the town council shall conduct annual reviews of the CUP. Ms. Jensen?
I was referring as specifically to the regulatory permitting process. I realize that there's a process contained in what we're considering tonight as well, but I wanted to make sure that I was correct about the permitting process.
So the regulatory permit also has the 1-year annual review, and the permit's only good for 1 year. It doesn't automatically renew.
Then I do have a follow-up question I think you were going to get to, which is the council is currently considering a new policy for a review of complaints regarding conditional use permits. And my question is, I know that we haven't finalized it, but I know that we did discuss at our meeting last time a process for the public to bring forward those complaints. So would what some members of the public have addressed tonight be contained in that new policy?
The policy we were working on was regarding conditional use permits. It wasn't specifically directed towards any other type of permit process.
I realize that, but let's imagine that a future firearms dealer or an existing firearms dealer was required to obtain a CUP, then complaints regarding that CUP would come under that process, correct?
Correct.
And the firearms code would set up, in addition to what would exist for all other CUP complaints, an annual compliance hearing with the council.
Ms. Jensen?
One final question on the same subject matter. Ms. Propp, I know that we got a communication from you regarding insertion of the word public before the hearings, as was suggested tonight and was also suggested in Ms. Mammell's letter. My understanding of your answer was that there's no real reason not to do it, except that for some sections of the code it's not contained there and it's presumed, but in other sections of the code it's actually specifically set forward. Is that right?
So as set forth in the desk item, all of the provisions of Chapter 29, which is the zoning code for the town, do not contain the word public before hearing, because under state law, it's required that land use matters and zoning matters be heard at both Planning Commission and Council at a public hearing. So staff consistently, when you look at the town code in Chapter 29, which is the zoning ordinance, does not contain the word public. However, in those other sections of the town code, such as Chapter 14, where the council recently adopted the business regulations that don't have a state law right to a public hearing, town staff recommended, and the council ad hoc subcommittee recommended, that the word public hearing be clearly delineated in that section in Chapter 14 for the firearms dealer permit, so as to create a right that those matters will be public hearing before town council. So it's not, I didn't want to suggest that it was a hodgepodge. It's a very intentional scheme when in drafting the language of the town code that has been over decades, that in the zoning ordinance the term public isn't included with hearing. But as you indicated, it's not technically wrong, it's just generally not consistent with the rest of the code.
Further questions? Ms. McNutt?
Thank you, Mayor. I have one question of staff and one question of the mayor. My question of staff is, someone referenced internet sales and e-commerce. My understanding is the town has no control over internet sales. Could you confirm or deny that?
Federal government regulates interstate commerce, and therefore the town doesn't have jurisdiction over regulations of internet sales. There are many businesses that already operating and have been operating in town for many years that have internet sales. And as far as how they do business, what they sell, things like that, the town does not regulate that.
And if I may add, the speaker specifically mentioned one of our business license sections dealing with e-commerce, which is to date and unused. We have not accepted a business license application or received one under e-commerce, but because what we anticipate as growing e-commerce activities with Amazon's decision to go to taxation and others, we do have our tax counsel looking at that e-commerce section for where it might be applicable. Nonetheless, the bottom line is the principal business of the activity determines what business license it receives, and to date, Templar Sports has requested and received a retail sales business license as their principal activity.
Okay, and again, the business license is a tax. It's not something that you review.
It's not a permissive act.
So just to insert a sentence before I turn to the mayor, as we go forward on this and things start to be implemented, I think it's going to be very important for staff to come up with a very clear document for the public on this idea of complaint and what can be complained about this within the town's control, and who to contact if they have complaints about, for example, products being sold. Maybe they would go to ATF, or I don't even know what else might come up, but because it's so complicated and confusing, and I think that's going to need some work to have a real clear public communication document. My question for the mayor is, how do you want to structure this next phase of the discussion? Because I know we all have a lot to say, so I don't know how to get started.
You just talk. I actually don't have an answer to that. I realize that there are instances. I don't have a formula for this specific agenda item. I know we have staff recommendation. So we can either ask questions, we can state our views, we can make a motion and state our views, we can, incorporate our views after the motion is made. And so there is no specific process that I envision for this agenda item.
And Madam Mayor, if I may clarify, staff's recommendations went to the ad hoc committee, then to the planning commission, and those are what are before you tonight, with one issue having multiple options for council discussion.
Yes, Mr. Larson, but as I understand what Ms. McNutt was asking, and also an issue I have in my own mind, is if you look on page 1 of the staff report, there is a menu of steps that the council could go through. However, those steps might encompass conditions or findings that a council member or members with which a council member or members may not agree. And so there is a process with which we have to deal.
Just like most zoning, yeah.
Ms. Jensen.
This is a process question as to one of those items where the council may not agree. The ordinance that we have, proposed ordinance, I should say ordinances, the amendments to the existing ordinances that we have contained in our staff report, which I guess start at attachment 5. 2910, the famous 2910-195 isn't included. So how and where should the council include that portion of the amendment? We do have that at page 4 and 5 of our staff report with an italicized, bolded suggestion, paragraph B5, but we don't have that anything in our suggested amended ordinances. So how would we go about including that and making a motion on it?
Madam Mayor, if I may respond, subject to any clarification by the attorney. If the ordinance were adopted as is, it would basically be the status quo of the ordinance for amortization, for example, as well as the other recommendations in terms of the zoning and the distance restrictions. All of that would be included as recommended by the ad hoc committee to the Planning Commission and now to the council. And in terms of the one open question, it would be the status quo because there would be no change. If a maker of a motion wanted to include a change, that's where you would reference back to the staff report, and the bolded item 5 could be added as part of the motion. Then that could be brought back to the council with the second reading embedded in the ordinance. If there were more extensive changes or lots of discussion or differing structures the council want to look at, the attorney and town staff might request a further first reading so that you see those changes in writing, and then that would be the first reading, which could occur at a September 30th special meeting or some future meeting, with then the second reading to come thereafter. I will point out second readings have to be at regularly scheduled meetings. First readings do not.
Ms. Jensen? And I should also point out that we have a special meeting for September 30th on hold for example, a continuation of the discussion or whatever of this agenda item.
It's a related question. So if a member of the council wanted to include a B5 in whatever form that may take, technically, if that came back and was included just with the blank that's filled in on page 5 of our staff report into the suggested amended ordinances that we're looking at and be included as this in the second reading, would all of the ordinance amendments be technically adopted at the same time so they become effective at the same time?
Yes, we would make that recommendation and bring either everything back if there were significant changes or changes that we're not able to draft from the dais tonight, which is very possible, that we would recommend having council continue this matter for a date specific, at which time staff would then bring back and introduce the ordinance with all the amendments that are determined by council tonight, and then bring it back for a second reading thereafter.
That would also further provide an opportunity for staff to include in the resolution any findings or determinations the council may make to justify the recommendation and action, so it's fully documented.
Ms. Jensen is done. Ms. McDutt.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'll just lay out the areas that I feel I need more clarification on or discussion of. The first is the idea of the identification of sensitive uses and the dimension of the buffer zone. I need more explanation from the subcommittee or from others as to why those are selected and how they're justified as sensitive uses. My experiences with sensitive uses has always been that there is something concrete that can be pointed to: noise, emissions, heavy equipment use, data collected on crime statistics, things like that. And we don't have any of those that I know of. So that's one area that I need discussion on before I can move ahead on that. The whole amortization obviously is going to be something that we all want to discuss. And then in addition, I'm hoping that we can talk about on the CUP any possible restrictions that we can have as a standard part of a CUP on signage and display of materials that can be viewed external to the store. And then lastly, this was kind of thrown in by staff as a cleanup measure. I have problems with the home occupancy permit for tax preparers and real estate professionals. And I would really like us to pull that off the table and not even try to talk about that, because it's really not part of this discussion. But if we want to, I can tell you why I'm not supportive of moving in that direction. So those are the areas that are of concern to me that I would like to hear more discussion on, if anybody would like to respond to any of those.
Discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I think at the first pass of this, the ad hoc committee left out government buildings, and then the discussion may have developed further, and we had actually two maps. Am I correct? Okay. So to me, the most obvious thing as far as public safety is a government building. In the past year, we've had a couple, maybe it's been a year and a half, but a couple threats against government buildings in town. And to me, having a crowded DMV about 60 feet away from the front door of Templar Sports in its current form doesn't really represent a safe situation, because the technical definition of a loaded gun in the state of California is ammunition in one hand and gun in the other, whether the gun's loaded or not. If you have ammunition that will fit in that gun, you have a loaded gun. So in theory, you have people who may be walking in and out of the establishment with loaded weapons. And I see that as very problematic for me, just in itself. There's been a number of speakers who have spoken about safe routes to school, parks, other businesses which support children's activities. In our report, it mentions places of worship. I agree with all those. I think a lot of times when people react, it's not the individuals in society who are those who are crazy. It's the ones who suddenly become crazy that we didn't expect. Road rage incidents or whatever. And being in close proximity would elevate the risk. So that's why I applaud the work of the ad hoc committee in coming up with this 250-foot radius and naming a number of different entities. So I'm perfectly fine with the language of that.
Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is in response to Councilwoman McNutt's question about identified sensitive receptors. The committee looked at the issues that I think community raised, and also what we have seen in other jurisdictions as they have gone forward to identify areas of concern. And if you look at this section under 2870-100, where it discusses permitted uses, this is section 1A, and it's all of the issues relative to schools, our education. So public or private daycare, daycare home, nursery school, elementary, junior high, and so forth and so on. B then is all premises occupied by government buildings, places of worship, public parks, public trails, as was pointed out by Council Member Leonardis. And I think in that second case, the first case is evident, and we see it in some of the other language of other jurisdictions or even state law relative to guns, that schools are identified as a very significant environment within which we want to make sure we have some degree of control. The second, government buildings, places of worship, public parks, public trails, that has a kind of a sense of gathering of individuals, more than the specific individual who would be there. But in government buildings, for example, here tonight, we could all be in jeopardy, but you all came together for this particular purpose. I think it works the same way with places of worship. It works the same way with parks. Then the third category was premises occupied, or premise occupied by any business primarily engaged in providing activities or instruction to persons under the age of 18, not listed above an A. And that was intended to take a look at other areas that might come into being subsequent, that would therefore be able to be identified. But for our purposes, okay, those places would be prior to our actually enacting the ordinance language, because at a certain point in time, some business moves out, someone else might want to move in right next to a particular conforming gun dealer, and that would not jeopardize that. The other issue that kind of overrides it and remains constant in all of this is we have to abide by the law. And there are Second Amendment rights that are very specific, and there is law that is very significant to us in terms of how we created or identified those areas of concern. We knew as a committee that we had to provide the opportunity for some gun purveyor to be able to exist in town by law. So when we looked at this, it had that context, and we can't ignore that context, okay? And there's where we looked at 500 feet, 250 feet, and so forth, because what we're looking for is having to fulfill the law and at the same time fulfill the community interests and issues, and that's where the language went. So for the justification, it was in that context, to protect those sensitive receptors that we identified with those 3 different categories, and then also to fulfill the language of the law and the language of court cases to this particular point. No question about it, okay? I believe it was Mr. Burt who brought that issue up, and that was fully in our consciousness. We relied very heavily on court decisions up to this particular point in time. Now, does this determine? Absolutely. There are other issues that we can deal with, and this amortization issue is one of them. But I think we need to make sure we keep that in mind, that we are in a context of having to both protect our community and also to protect our community in 2 ways, both from the point of view of the issuance of guns in the community and then fulfilling the language of the law that's very driven by the Second Amendment.
Ms. Jensen?
As the second member of the ad hoc committee, first I'd like to thank my fellow committee member for all his hard work and echo his comments that he just made. I just wanted to emphasize that Councilwoman McNutt had the question specifically with respect to sensitive receptors. We did look at ordinances from all around the state for what had been done and chose very carefully what had been upheld, for example, in Livermore or Lafayette, and other locations. We did our research about what was acceptable or not acceptable. And in the recent case that was decided just a week ago in San Francisco by the federal court in San Francisco, which is Texera versus County of Alameda, there was a challenge to a 500-foot buffer zone in Alameda County from schools. And the federal court cited many other Supreme Court cases, et cetera, but one of the statements that the case makes is that the ordinance in Alameda County was based on important governmental objections, and went on to observe that Alameda County had an interest in protecting public safety and preventing harm in populated, well-traveled, and sensitive areas, such as residentially zoned districts. It goes on to mention schools because that's what the ordinance was. That case also indicates that there doesn't have to be a perfect match between the ordinance and the prevention. You aren't necessarily going to prevent gun-related violence, but you do have to have interests that the government generally protects, which are public safety, health, and welfare, which is what the committee was doing by identifying these buffer zones and choosing the sensitive receptors. And as Ms. Mammal pointed out, and as this recent decision points out, laws that regulate commerce in this fashion are presumptively valid, and they don't violate the Second Amendment, which protects your right to bear arms, but not necessarily a commercial right to sell them.
Further discussion? Well, on the general topics that people have discussed so far, I want to echo that I appreciate the work done by the ad hoc committee. For practical reasons, as upheld by legal reasoning, I think the committee's identification of sensitive receptors is appropriate. It's definitely appropriate in our community. I also appreciate the ad hoc committee's selection of 250 feet. I believe that an Oakland case had 1,000 feet. Maybe it was Palo Alto with 500 feet. So there are municipalities with greater distances, but what the ad hoc committee recognized, as do I, is that if you use those greater distances, it would in effect bar firearm sales in our town in toto, and that would not, I think that would be very shaky ground for the town if it were challenged on that. So I believe that the selection of 250 feet, which allows for some areas of town where firearm sales could occur, was a good recommendation from the ad hoc committee.
Madam Mayor,
Mr.
as staff
Manager?
is trying to keep track of direction council's going, so we can summarize at the end. We've heard positive comments regarding government and sensitive receptors and schools. I did want to clarify then that that makes moot another issue you were discussing, which was the earlier in the evening, which is under the amortization B4, that the clause that people were wondering if it should apply, whether it's downtown, because the language of that is when a zoning amendment is adopted after 1981 that causes a use to be non-conforming solely by subjecting it to the requirement of obtaining a conditional use permit, then it would be 60 days. If you adopt government, sensitive receptors, and or school, well, not schools, but government and sensitive receptors, the existing firearms retailer is within 250 feet of those and is therefore non-conforming both by not having a CUP and by violating the radius that you have. So if you wanted to do an amortization schedule, setting a specified period of time of 60 days to 20 years, it would have to be under that clause 5 in the staff report.
Thank you. So, Ms. Jensen.
I would like to try something with your indulgence, and that is to make a motion that's limited to those things that I think perhaps the council can agree on, leaving out in my initial motion any question regarding amortization periods. So if I'm referring to page 1 of our staff report on the recommendations, the numbers, I do not need to make a motion, although I'll observe that I would recommend that we accept the Planning Commission's findings and recommendations. And
I'm going to jump in there. Hold on.
Okay.
I'm going to ask the clerk administrator to read the title of the proposed ordinance.
And I have asked her when you called at this point to read all the ordinances or the 2 ordinances that are before you, just so that's done with.
Thank you.
Ordinance 1, ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos amending sections of the zoning ordinance, Chapter 29 of the Town Code designating zoning and regulations for the sale of firearms and ammunition, prohibiting home occupation permits, revocations, and the duties of the Planning Commission and the Town Council. Ordinance 2, ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos repealing the portion of Section 18.70.015 that allows the discharging of firearms on private property.
Thank you. Ms. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll just make a comment with respect to Section 18. We haven't discussed it, but my motion is going to include that, which is would essentially be deleting or revoking that portion of our existing town code, which currently makes it legal to discharge a firearm if you have property of over 5 acres. So I do intend to include that in my abbreviated motion. So my first item would be, as I said, to accept the Planning Commission's findings and recommendations in the form of meeting minutes for the zoning code amendment, which is attachment 3 of our staff report. Make the required finding that the proposed zoning code amendments are consistent with the general plan and its elements, which is attachment 4. I think the only finding that's required for that is a simple statement that's in attachment 4 that the proposed town code is consistent. I'm not And then it's also a Town Code Amendment A1301 regarding home occupation. And my motion is going to include that we do add that to the list on the policy. I don't think it affects a further discussion of whether income tax preparers or real estate is appropriately included. It simply adds it. I don't know why we couldn't reconsider it later if we thought that it was worthwhile to change that in some other manner. So my motion will include adding home occupation to that A1301. That is number 3. In the numbered items. Number 4 is that I would move to waive, sorry. Can you make a motion in the middle of my motion?
No, not I. I'm saying, are you going to make?
Yeah, I'm making a motion.
Motion required for that?
Yeah, so my motion is that we, I'm sorry to make it clear, that we do adopt the recommendation of the Planning Commission and move to adopt the Zoning Code Amendment A1301, which has to do with home occupation permits, and that we include that as part of the amendments that we're doing tonight, with noting Councilwoman McNutt's desire to reconsider other portions of it, which I don't think a motion to add home occupation would preclude. In number 4 is move to waive the reading of the zone change ordinance and make a specific motion with respect to that. And I'm including these all at once to try to get, hopefully, them done. Number 5, move to introduce the ordinance of the Town of Los Gatos affecting zone code amendment to the A1301. That's attachment 5, and again, that's home occupation. But I think it's also our entire ordinance, am I correct? That's contained in 5. So my motion is to do that. With respect to further findings, I think that Councilperson Brzezinski and I have talked about the sensitive receptors. We've talked about, or the mayor has very nicely summed up why we chose the 250-foot barrier. I did say that with respect to legal questions that as I understand it in very recent week ago rulings, that this type of regulatory permitting or zoning for commercial retail sales of firearms is presumptively valid. I think that the code amendments that we're proposing here are consistent with those that are adopted in other jurisdictions similar to ours. I think that we've been clear throughout the record that what we are doing is in response to a desire to protect the public interest, general health, safety, and general welfare of the town of Los Gatos. We are not and I do not intend by my motion to put any existing business out of business. I don't think the amendments do that. They simply establish a framework for any future firearms dealer to come in and comply with both our regulatory permit process and the land use amendments that we're considering tonight. They don't require an existing business to move.
I'm going to step in here just for a second. Have you gone through all of the motions you intend to make?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was just going to add for the record some findings, but I'm happy to stop there. I'm not specifically including my motion at this point because I think there'll be further discussion regarding it, any motion with respect to an amortization period. However, my motion specifically does not contemplate leaving the status quo. So I don't know how to make that clear in adopting the recommendation.
Let me step in here and maybe help. Have you made your motions on staff reports number 6 and 7? Did you say those two?
I think I did not say. Well, 6 as I understand it. Wait a minute, 6 is. Remind me what 6 is? That's the proposed ordinance, yes. Correct? Amendments?
And if I may clarify for the record, A1301 throughout the recommendation and the report includes all of the zoning ordinance changes that affect home occupation, firearms, conditional use permit, and is the primary substance of what you're discussing. So what we have heard as staff is a motion made for items 1 through 6, encompassing all of ordinance amendment to the town code of A1301.
With the specific exception that my motion does not include a recommendation to leave the status quo with respect to amortization.
And I was going to make that clear. I hear this as a motion inclusive of 1 through 6 on page 1 of the staff report, exclusive of any provisions in those documents that relate to amortization in any fashion. And Ms. Jensen, are you including the fee for firearms in this time?
I intend to include that. Thank you, and thank you for your specific statement regarding what I intended. That's correct. I do intend to exclude amortization, and I do intend to include in my motion item 7, which is adopting the fee schedule as proposed.
All right, we have a motion on the table. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, motion and a second. Discussion. Mr. Brzezinski.
So, given that we are at a point where there's only one item from tonight's discussion left to be decided, and that's amortization, yes or no, is there any issue with our having that discussion and then subsequently returning, because I know we're not going to try to write language tonight necessarily, returning at the next hearing with that amendment, should we come to some conclusion and ask staff to frame this in a context for us?
Let me step in there. I will ask Mr. Larson if he agrees with me. I would see us acting on the motion on the table and voting that up, down, maybe. Then I would see us going to the idea of amortization, the concept, and coming up with a motion, hopefully on amortization, that we can agree to, and then asking staff to come back with whatever we decide folded into 1 through 7. Mr. Larson.
Not addressing amortization in the motion before you leaves the status quo amortization in place. So I believe you have two options. One, the mayor outlined, which is to adopt this the way it is, and then to provide direction tonight for staff to bring back what would be a new first reading to change the amortization. I'd look to the attorney about blending it in.
Well, I'm going to step in, but this motion specifically excludes amortization in the items that we are currently having before us.
Understood, and I was trying to be clear, and I'll try to be more clear, that by not addressing amortization in this motion, if this were the only motion to pass, the existing amortization language in the code remains unchanged. So therefore, that remains what's applicable. By not addressing amortization and making any changes to it, what is already there remains. So you have two options as I see it. One, you could have the motion on the floor stand as it is. You could then go into the amortization discussion, and somebody could look to move to amend the motion to include what is your amortization decision discussion to then proceed with the motion. Or you could view them as two separate code changes. You have this one, which changes everything but amortization, and then you could have a separate discussion and action on amortization. And that would be a separate code change then.
I think we're doing the second, but I'll look to the maker of the motion.
My intention was the second. My intention is not to retain the status quo, as I believe there will be differences of opinion regarding the amortization period. I didn't want to risk the bulk of the motion on that, so I was hoping that we could discuss the motion in place, and then a council member could bring a motion with respect to amortization, which I would envision either as being status quo, well, one of the options presented, and if it were an ordinance change, I would imagine that that would be a simple change of adopting, for example, paragraph 5, B5 on page 5 of our staff report. Am I right about that?
There is one additional legal issue about bifurcating an application and having a first reading and second reading, and maybe the attorney's best to address that.
So one of the questions that Councilmember Jensen asked earlier is how would we mesh the effective dates if you did adoption in pieces and parts? It would be our recommendation is that if you adopt or introduce the ordinance and approve a motion tonight, address the issue on amortization or any other matters that the council can't agree on in the main motion, allow staff to bring that back for an introduction and its own reading, and then bring all of the items back at a combined time for a second reading so they actually have the same effective date and they're adopted at the same time.
Ms. Jensen.
I guess I don't understand why having two motions changes the dates, because if we were to have the discussion tonight, and let's imagine that the motion on the floor passes or fails, we could adopt that, it'd come back for the second reading at our next meeting. If we had a second motion that said, and we also want to amend 2910-185, as indicated on page 5 of our staff report, and do that tonight as well, why can't that come back as part of a second reading at the same time as the first motion?
I have the same question.
And that may be a possibility depending on what the language is and whether it is consistent with the draft language that's been before you, or whether you make significant changes to that. And the more significant changes that you make at that point, we can follow up with a recommendation whether that's a sufficient introduction or if it needs to be reintroduced. If it follows the format that's in the staff report without any material changes other than a date that's been discussed, then it's likely that you could introduce it and bring back all of the motions at a second reading for a second reading at the same time.
Ms. Jensen?
I'm not comfortable with it's likely that, so I'm assuming that the answer is if it conforms to paragraph B5 on page 5 of our staff report and simply inserts a time period that council sees no reason why it can't come back at the same time as the other. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Brzezinski.
Is it not correct that in any case the ordinance does not have effect until we've done the second reading?
An ordinance is not adopted until the second reading, and then it's 30 days thereafter at the soonest that it can be effective.
So it seems that there isn't an issue, that that we can actually discuss beyond the motion and then insert another motion, not an amendment, but another motion to add language to what we've already determined. Is that not correct?
I think that would work, and I like the idea the attorney laid out of bringing those back for the second reading at the same time, and that's where you get a single consolidated document.
All right, and that's what we're doing. Okay, further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I'm sorry that the motion includes that home occupancy thing, which again, I think is really off topic, and it annoys me that it's part of this motion, so it makes it difficult for me to support the important part of the motion because of that extraneous items that were put in there. And I'm also disappointed that we're not looking at ways of putting in more specific conditions on the CUP regarding signage and display of materials. So I understand the eagerness to try to get something approved tonight, but it's going to make it very difficult for me to vote for this because of those two minor items compared to the bulk of the subject matter.
Further discussion. Mr. Brzezinski.
Could I ask Councilwoman McNutt, what would be your preference in terms of both those items?
I'm going to suggest, just for propriety, that you could put that request out there, but she may or may not choose to answer.
Oh, knowing Councilwoman McNutt, she always has the option to respond or not. But I'll put that out there at the mayor's request. You know, if there's a response that you could assist me in as the seconder of the motion, if there is need to make some alteration.
Further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
Yes, in answer to the question that came in out of nowhere, what would make me happy is if the home occupancy, the reference to tax preparers and real estate was taken out of that, and we deal with that later or never.
Ms. McNutt, before you go further, what page, paragraph, line item are you exhibit?
I have the reference available, Ms. McNutt.
Mr. Larson.
It's attachment 5, the actual ordinance that's before you. And it is page, when you go to definitions, it starts on the bottom of what is page 1, and rolls over to the top of page 2. So income tax preparers is on the bottom of page 1 of Exhibit A of Attachment 5, and real estate office uses is on top of page 2 of Exhibit A of Attachment 5.
It's adding 5 prohibited uses, and I would like to just take out 2 and just have 3, the most important of which being retail sales of firearms. So taking out 2 and 3 on that.
All right, and so I will go to the maker of the motion. It's 2
I'm
and...
sorry, 2 and 4, he says.
Right.
Yep, sorry.
It's 2 and 4. Maker of the motion, do you agree, would you agree, to remove from home occupation portion of this ordinance subsections 2 and 4?
As long as I understand correctly that, or everyone understands correctly, that the motion includes paragraph 1, retail sales of firearms, ammunition, and/or destructive devices, then in order to attempt to gain unanimity, I would include in my motion deleting paragraph 2, income tax preparers, and item 4, real estate office uses, which I assume means a change in the current planning commission or planning department policy as well, correct?
That would be a separate matter. The town policy would remain unless the council provided direction for staff to abate enforcement of that until returning for a policy discussion.
Okay, so as the maker of the motion, I am willing to amend the motion to delete paragraphs 2 and 4 from section 29.10.09025 home occupations.
Mr. Brzezinski.
So as of the approval, then we will be flooded with income tax preparers and real estate offices in our neighborhood. Is that
No, just your neighborhood, actually.
Okay.
And Ms. McNutt.
I'm willing, for sake of, how'd you say it, unanimity, to agree with that.
All right, further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
And then my last item, that perhaps maybe staff could just reassure me that at some point we can have conversation about the CUP and about CUP conditions, and I understand the First Amendment regulations that we have, but whatever restrictions we can put in terms of signage and display of materials viewed externally, that could happen separate from this ordinance, that would make me happy.
We can add that to our, we have a list of miscellaneous amendments. We can add that to it.
Ms. McNutt, anything further? Anybody else? All right, we have an omnibus motion before us. Before we vote, any council person want any clarification? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Now, I am mindful of the amortization issue, and Ms. Jensen, I look to you.
So I'm just going to, for purposes of getting the discussion started and to make sure that we have a second motion, I'm going to make a motion that we also adopt a zoning code amendment in conjunction with those that we've just adopted, which would amend section 29.10.195, termination of nonconforming use status, to include a subparagraph B, subparagraph 5, that a business engaged in the retail sales of firearms and or destructive devices shall cease, insert 60 days, strike or years from the date it becomes nonconforming. And the reasons for making that motion, and I'll just state them before I see whether there's a second or not, so I put the discussion out there, is that I haven't heard anything tonight that makes me believe that subsection B4 is not squarely applicable to this particular process that we're looking at. It's not, what we're looking at is not related to a particular downtown, and I'm not convinced that we know what downtown is. It's not a residential zone. It's not a junkyard. It's not anything in A that I can see. I'm not sure that B3 is the right thing, but B4 seems to squarely apply, that what the town would be doing under its new ordinances is to make a use non-conforming solely by subjecting it to the requirement of obtaining conditional use permit. I heard Mr. Larson's argument. I disagree with it, that all the use affected by the amendment shall apply for a use permit within 60 days. I don't find it convincing that the town hasn't used that ordinance. I really don't understand why. And if we haven't used it, I really don't understand why we have it. So as one of our speakers indicated, and I apologize for not recognizing which one, if we have a town code on the books which specifically makes an amortization period of 60 days applicable to this item, it's presumptively valid. It's presumptively reasonable. And because regulatory land use is presumptively lawful under the law, certainly as of a week ago in the Northern District of California where we are, it strikes me that it's entirely reasonable to apply an existing section of our ordinance when it squarely applies to this particular item that we're discussing. So my motion is for 60 days.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion by Ms. Jensen, seconded by the Vice Mayor, and we are looking at an amendment to 2910-195 B5. Discussion. This will be a quiet discussion. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking at this in a totally different interpretation of the law that I see before us, and just as Ms. Jensen doesn't see any reason why it can't go this way, I cannot get past the fact that it very clearly states in 2910-195A4 that if it's non-residential in the downtown, and whether we like it or not, the general plan defines what downtown is, and this property is in it, which would otherwise be conforming, and which occurred after July 1, 1982, that's what we have. We might not like it, but that is what our legal documents are telling us is the case. So I can't get past that, and I certainly can't see a legal argument or a rational argument for me to do anything as radical as a 60-day when we have no history of that with anything else. So I'm way, way far away from supporting this.
Further discussion? Mr. Brzezinski.
Yeah, I think we just unanimously agreed on a motion that makes the current establishment non-conforming. And from my perspective, I think that now we are in very difficult territory from the point of view of law, as I understand it. We may have some personal desires to feel that, this type of business should not exist in town, but I think force of law and the situation we have set up is basically an irresolvable conflict for us as a community at this point. And the conflict is that we have now made a business that it was legal and conforming by law, because that's what our law said, that's what our language said. We didn't have language that prevented us from allowing that to happen. So as far as I'm concerned, that is the status of this particular business. And then to turn that into what would be impossible, I would think, given what we had, the minimum that we know of the business and its operation at this point in time. I think that we have clearly opened ourselves to a very strong case from the individual who would be the plaintiff in this case, and I would ask that we walk very cautiously into this situation. I think we've built into all of our language of this ordinance so many significant protections and the opportunity on an annual basis to review, that we have some constraints that are now available to us that were not before we made this decision, and to act in a way that I think is very, very questionable from the point of view of legal fairness, would jeopardize the community in some way, and I really don't think I can support the motion that has been made at this time.
Further discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. With respect to Mr. Brzezinski's comments, I think legal fairness is best interpreted by the courts. This business can still function as a sporting goods retail and repair business. When they turned in their forms to our community development department, that's what they said they were going to be. They can sell canteens, they can sell tents, they can sell all kinds of goods that support the outdoorsman sporting community. And I don't really believe that, by adopting this amortization period, we're still giving them an opportunity to potentially, operate. This doesn't take away from their business model, which they disclose to us through all their forms going through community development. So I have no problem with it. I'm looking at protecting the general welfare of the people, as raised by a majority of the residents of Los Gatos that have attended these meetings, and that's why I think this is important. I do applaud the work of the ad hoc committee, and on one hand, the ad hoc committee is saying one thing, but on the other hand, we're trying to anticipate or predict or determine what or what may not happen in a court, and that's not our job here this evening.
Further discussion? For myself, I was actually excited to get Lisa Mammel's September 13th, 2013 letter, because I thought it had given me clear direction from our ordinances that mandated under our ordinances and general plan 60 days amortization period. However, in revisiting the ordinances and the general plan myself, whether or not I personally agree with it or not, it is my conclusion that our general plan and ordinances do not apply the 60 days to the downtown encompassed by Templar. And so therefore, I am not prepared to support the motion, not because I don't want to, not because I don't understand why the maker and seconder of the motion made the motion, or why Ms. Mammal and others sent supporting documentation, but because I am doing my best that I know how to follow our existing ordinances. I also believe that once you do not have an existing ordinance, that does not mean that you revert to 20 years. Because as our staff report has pointed out, we have the ability and the right to create a reasonable amortization period, that we balance the facts that have been put before us, and we create a reasonable amortization period. I think it's a reasonable accommodation to competing interest is the law that we are supposed to follow. Now, interestingly enough, the existing retailer about whom we are speaking has not really provided much evidence. And so the only evidence I could find in going through the papers here scattered in front of me and at my home was a lease. And that lease has challenges because it doesn't appear to even be in the right names. But assuming that that is the lease for Templar, it started in 2011. The business started in December of 2012. The lease ends, interestingly enough, on September 16th, 2014, which is 1 year from today. And then they have the ability to extend, to renew the lease for, let's see, for 2 more years, I think. Yes, until September 30th, 2017. So for me, those are the only facts that I have upon which to create a reasonable amortization time frame. I'm not making the motion and before us now, but if this motion doesn't pass and another motion comes forward, those are the kind of facts that I will be looking for, because I don't see anything else before us that we can use. Further discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor, I can see you turned your light on.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. In reference to the lease, it was leased by an entity called Hill Development, and a real estate office was being run out of there. And I don't see any sublease agreement between that entity and Templar Armaments. And in the lease, it specifically states that any subleasing has to be approved by the landlord and yada, yada, yada. So where I'm going with this is I'm not sure that the lease is even valid. There might be a sublease agreement that is verbal or being used between Templar and the original lessor. So with that said, I didn't put too much weight on the time frame. I did think about that initially when the lease would be up. And I just thought that, along with the way it was presented in the original forms that we got through the Community Development Department, and all the discrepancies between dates and titles of the business and what they would be selling and what they wouldn't be selling, and a number of other entities from the previous meetings as well as this evening, I just thought, what would be fair and reasonable? And, you know, if a junkyard could be shut down in 90 days or relocated or whatever, I think 60 days seems like a reasonable amount of time for a business that has actually only been in business for 8 months. It would be far different if that business was in business for 20 years or something to that effect. I would say there's got to be some rule of thumb where you say, for like when you have severance from a corporation. I've been working here 20 years, and for every 20 years, I get 2 weeks pay. Or, I mean, for every year of service, I get 2 weeks pay. So this is what my retirement package will be. So I guess where I'm coming from, I didn't think 60 days was an unreasonable short amount of time. And that's why I supported the motion. And I see nothing in the lease that convinces me that this is even a lease that Templar is a party to as an entity.
Ms. Jensen.
I appreciate the comments from all my fellow council people, and I was actually going to see if the mayor wanted to suggest an amendment to my motion for a couple of reasons. As I did with my prior motion when Councilwoman McNutt brought up the issue regarding changing some of the home occupancy language, I do think it's very important that the council present a united front on what we do with respect to legislation or ordinances. So while I feel strongly that the 60-day is appropriate and does apply, I hear what other people say, and if the seconder is willing to consider it, I would move to amend my motion to a 3-year period, the reason being the dates that the mayor mentioned that make sense, and that also the town has a 3-year period in its code already, which I think makes a 3-year period reasonable. Given the leasing situation and given arguments that could be made, and given my very strong desire to try to present a unified front on this issue, and bearing in mind that we have a year-long review process in the permitting ordinance and a year review or possibly more in the CUP process, I would be willing to amend my motion to 3 years if the seconder was willing to go there.
And before we go to the seconder, 3 years measured from where to where?
Gosh, that's a good question. I guess from the date of the original lease, the way the mayor presented
Yeah,
the dates. What was it, September?
Putting aside the validity of the lease, which I'll speak to later. The original lease was October 2011. The move-in date was December 2012. The first term of the lease ends in September of 2014, the second term in September of 2017.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. A word I swore I would never say as a council person, but I just did. So it makes sense to me, given that a 1-year period from adoption of the ordinance would make sense, because if we take September 2014, that's a year from now. That seems more than reasonable. It seems consistent with the other sections in paragraph B, and I would point out that paragraph B of 2910-195 are, I'm not going to say arbitrary, but clearly are dates that have been selected with respect to a use, not a location. So what we're considering here is a use, that being a retail firearm shop. So a year from the date the ordinance, these land use ordinances is adopted, would be my new and improved suggested amended motion, if that's okay with the seconder.
All right, so we have 1 year amortization, 1 year from the date of the adoption of an ordinance. Mr. Leonardis.
I'll second that.
Further discussion? Mr. Brzezinski.
We have one instance of a 90-day for a junkyard that is historic in nature, I'm convinced. I'm sure this wasn't just pulled out of the air. Some event took place that created that. These things aren't divinely inspired, you know. Someone had to say, there's a junkyard sitting right here, and we want to create a park. Not knowing the circumstance, not knowing the specifics of this case, it stands as kind of a unique event. My concern is, and even though it's been voiced that it's not our our role to consider litigation. It is our role to consider litigation. It is. That's part of what we do. Okay? I am not going to put the town in jeopardy and ignore something that belongs under our purview. So I am very concerned about this, and I really feel that it is necessary for us to thoroughly evaluate whether or not we're putting this in a situation where, putting us in a situation where we cannot defend ourselves. I have heard, the statement, the majority of the community. We've not heard from the majority of the community. We've heard from some people who are very interested and very dedicated to the benefit and the protection of our community, and I regard that. But I've also heard in this chamber and outside this chamber from people who say, I think if this was if they went through all the things that they were supposed to legally do and they got in, then to force a particular purveyor out is just not right. I've heard from other people to say, you really need to evaluate what you're doing in a very rigorous way, because we have to, in some way, assure ourselves that we are fulfilling the law in the greater sense. So I am uncomfortable with kind of the direction when I look at where have we gone before. 20 years seems to have been the thing we've consistently used. And I do believe that in a course of time, that 20 years is something that someone's going to call out to us. I'm not saying that's the magic number, and I'm not saying that that's something that I think we should move toward, but I am saying we have to consider this very seriously, okay? And I think that it's important for us to take the legal considerations very seriously, and to perhaps understand more what those legal parameters are. It's been said that a good decision is one that doesn't please anybody, and that's the direction we're heading. Okay, so I do think that we have to be very cautious in this regard, and the calculation I'm hearing doesn't seem to necessarily approach the issue of and what would be the outcome if there was litigation that took place, and what's the potential for serious litigation to take place. And we've already heard that there is significant indication that serious litigation would take place.
Further discussion, Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. The voices inside my head aren't ringing serious litigation. We're the policymakers, and in the last couple of years, we've been sued a couple times on another project, and it was quite clear to me during the public hearing that that would be the case. I still voted the way I was going to vote, and I don't let the threat of litigation overtake the general welfare of the public. So I'm not so concerned about it. Again, I'm not going to base an analysis of what the ad hoc committee has put together, and they've done a great job with, on a perceived threat of litigation or threats. I mean, it's another form of bullying as far as I'm concerned. And being that one of our police officers would be suing his own government, I just don't think that's going to occur. And I think there's other ways to remedy that. So again, I'm sticking with the motion, and I'm not going to be scared by litigation moving forward. If that's the course of action that goes forward, then that's what we have to deal with. But I think there's risk to both sides if litigation is brought forward, and I think the risk could be far greater. Again, we're not trying to legislate or put a proprietor out of business. They are a sporting goods retail and repair organization. They can sell ping pong tables. They can sell a lot of other things. We're not taking away their right to do business in this town. We're putting in place a time frame where they can comply, and I think it's reasonable and it's in the interest of the general welfare, and that's why I'm taking this stance.
Sort of in between Mr. Przinski and the vice mayor, am I mindful of the threat of litigation? Yes. Does it form a basis for my decision? No. I am very comfortable that what we are called upon to do as a council is balance the interests that are presented to us based on the evidence that is presented to us. And as I said previously, that evidence is very sparse in this case. Everybody had the opportunity to give us materials upon which to base our decision, and pretty much all we have is a lease that may or may not be valid. But to the vice mayor's statements, I am assuming, based upon the statements that have been made to me by staff, that this is a valid lease. And although I'm probably not going to, I know I'm not going to make anybody up here to my left or to my right happy. Even though the motion was amended to 1 year, I am still not going to support the motion. Given the terms of the lease, I would support one for 4 years that would take it out to 2017, but to have the abatement occur next year, it was a close call for me, but I'm just not comfortable. So I have to go with my weighing of the facts, and so I cannot support the motion. Further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted a clarification from staff. If any of these motions go forward for a period of time, and whether it's 1 year, 3 years, 20 years, and the business does not come into conformance, they still have the option of moving to a site down the street where they would be in conformance. Is that not correct?
They would have to go through the conditional use permit process that you just approved at the new site.
But they would be entitled to be considered as a firearms, because we just made legal firearms retail sales with a conditional use permit.
That met all the specifications, correct.
So if there is any thought by anyone that this is going to drive them out of town in one way or eliminate firearms retail sales, it is not. It's a different legal issue. I just want to make sure we all know what we're talking about here in terms of the public. Is that correct?
How the proprietor will respond in the face of the council action, we obviously can't predict. The ordinance you just approved the first introduction of clearly allows a firearms retailer to exist in town, whether it's the incumbent relocating or a new one opening up.
Thank you.
Further discussion? All right, seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Opposed? Yes. Opposed, no. So the motion fails 2-3. Do I have any other motions? Ms. Jensen.
I'll just keep doing it. Because I heard from the mayor that 4 years, and because I think it's important that there be a limit that is not 20 and is not forever, although that is longer than I personally think would be appropriate. Again, as I indicated earlier, I think it's important that the council present a hopefully united front with respect to the regulations that it adopts, that it can make a strong argument for. I think there's lots of language contained in our codes that would support 60 days, would support 90 days, would support 3 years, would support not necessarily 20 years, but that's as far out as I would go. I would also note that hasn't been discussed that when the Planning Commission heard this matter, it specifically recommended to us, or it specifically noted that the members of the Planning Commission felt that forever was too long, And they also, I believe, felt that 20 years was too long, 60 days was too short, and they were coming in generally around 2 or 3 years. So given that our Planning Commission considered this, a body which I respect greatly, and heard testimony on it, and given that the only thing we have in front of us to go by is our code section, and I think it's important that what we adopt is reasonably related to the codes we have in place, and is also can be reasonably related to some evidence we have before us. And if the evidence we have before us is a lease, which I'm going to, for purposes of this motion, assume is valid, I am going to try again to put a limit on the amortization period, and this time I'm going to try for 4 years.
I'm going to second that motion for all of the reasons that I previously stated. And first, I want to thank the Planning Commission for, to the extent that it weighed in on amortization. Obviously, it is the maybe the most difficult issue on the ordinance with which we're currently dealing. I felt as though the Planning Commission wanted to weigh in on it more. I had hoped that they would consider it as part of a motion and have a discussion within the motion context. I was concerned about the fact that, in my perception, staff was steering the Planning Commission away from a motion and consideration and amortization, since I would have liked their decision and their direction. But that being said, I heard the same thing Ms. Jensen did, or maybe a little less. I heard that 60 days was too little, 20 years was too much. And as I sit here before you tonight, I am comfortable with 4 years. Further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I'm not going to be comfortable because it seems like an arbitrary number to me. We keep talking about a valid lease, and what we mean by a valid lease is we don't know if that is the current lease because it is private information. They are not required to give us a copy of the lease. And so I don't see how basing it on some paperwork that may or may not be in place, they could by this time have a 25-year lease. So, you know, should we go with that? So it's too arbitrary for me. It does not fall within the legal guidelines that we currently have in our code, and therefore I can't support it.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I'd like to ask staff a question. How do we go about obtaining a copy of this lease when we obtained it? And was it presented as the current lease, the valid lease, by the owners of Templar Armaments?
It was given to us by representatives of Templar. There was no documented representation of what it reflected. We did ask Templar last week in response to council inquiry for a copy of their lease and any attachments, and that has not been provided.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. So when they filled out the form saying that they were going to be doing improvements to the real estate office or the contractor's office, I think they used both terms. And I think when that this is the form for the Community Development Department for their building permits, it's an application. I believe we request a copy of the lease to see if it's all right with the landlord, or we need the landlord's consent for them to do the improvements. Therefore, we requested a copy at that time, or was a copy provided at that time?
I'll give my recollection then and see if Ms. Bailey has additional information. The property owner is required to sign the permit. That can be separate from the applicant. And in all cases, I believe the property owner did sign the permit, but that doesn't necessarily require providing the lease. I'm trying to think back to the chronology we created of this whole circumstance that was given to council. And I have a recollection the lease was obtained more like December or January. Do you have any differing recollection of December 2012, January of 2013 is when I think we obtained the lease, but I'm not.
Yeah, I think it was after the building permit. It wasn't part of the building permit process. And we don't normally ask, I don't say normally, we don't ask for leases as part of the building permit process.
Mr. Vice Mayor?
So my recollection of the forms that were submitted as part of the process with the February 5th meeting and such was that the landlord consented to improvements to a real estate office or a contractor's office, but what was not necessarily consenting to improvements on a gun shop or a sporting goods retail repairs establishment. So I guess that's where the confusion lies. In the lease, it says that it has to, there's a number of things that are in the lease that say improvements can't be done without the landlord's consent, but I feel like the landlord consented to information that was not properly presented to him. So my trouble is, where do we stand legally with this document? If somebody drops a box of ammo on their foot when they walk into this gun shop and they sue the landlord, and he comes back to the town of Los Gatos and says, you know, I was only consenting to improvements on a real estate office or a contractor's office, and yet there's a gun shop here, and I didn't know there was a gun shop here. What is our liability? In other words, don't we see a valid lease as being a necessary document if we're going to be basing an amortization period off of that lease?
I'm not going to speak in the regards of liability, but in terms of someone obtaining a planning approval to get a business license, we do have the property owner sign that form, and the property owner has to sign any planning application form. And so Templar Sports was part of that process, and the property owner did sign those documents.
In any private party dispute, the town is not party to unless one of the entities feel we have an obligation. I haven't heard anything that suggested the town is involved in any such hypothetical. We do know only what we've told you, which is they provided this lease. A representative of Templar provided the document that was submitted to council, and they have not submitted any alternative documents.
Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Seeing none?
No.
Oh, Mr. Brzezinski.
So in the motion, Madam Mayor, the start point is the enacting of the ordinance, is that correct? So the start date for the 4 years that's being proposed.
Yes, that's how I understand it. In my second, Ms. Jensen?
Yes.
Further discussion? All right, seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Mr. Brzezinski, did you vote yes? All right, it passes 4-1. Staff, I believe that's the last thing, but what do you think?
And just to clarify, on the record, since the final motion was a successor to the first motion made, what the council actually acted upon was on page 5 of the staff report, adding a new section B5 that says a business engaged in the retail sale of firearms and/or destructive devices shall cease 4 years from the date it becomes non-conforming. And I'm just confirming for the record that was the motion.
If non-conformance commences on the date the ordinance is adopted.
Effective
Effective.
30 days after adoption.
All right.
That was my question, and if the answer is yes, then fine.
Is this coming back, do you know if this is coming back to us September 30th, or is that an issue to be resolved?
A second reading can't occur at a special meeting, so it would have to come back to you at one of your next.
Is this the first reading?
I believe this constitutes the first reading. I'll leave that final judgment to
The clerk read the title. The actions were duly noticed and meet the requirements of an introduction of an ordinance.
All right, so this
and
is a first reading, yes. Okay.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Brzezinski.
We were voting on the 4-year issue, but is that the phraseology that we want? That the retail sales and destructive devices shall cease. Shouldn't it be, shall either come into conformance or cease? Because at a certain point in time, they could theoretically move to another location that would make them conforming.
I will look to staff because that's their wording.
If
No,
they
it's
were
the
to relocate
committee's-
and obtain a CUP, they'd no longer be non-conforming at the new location.
Or if there's some other way in which they could, theoretically, the business, DMV and goes away. I don't know. I'm just thinking, it seems like the language says you got 4 years and then you're done, versus you have 4 years and unless you come into conformance, then you must cease.
I'm looking to the ad hoc committee and staff. Ms. Jensen?
The ad hoc committee actually didn't draft this language
No, it
because we could not agree on the time period. But if I read it correctly, my interpretation would be 4 years from the date it becomes nonconforming, which presumably would be the date that the ordinance is enacted, as we've discussed. It could become conforming in a number of ways. It could get a CUP, a sensitive receptor could move, it could move. So specifically, the ad hoc committee didn't address it, but I'm comfortable as I read this that it's 4 years from any triggering factor.
I know
Staff?
the council doesn't like drafting from the dais. Becomes and remains non-conforming. Does that address the council members?
I don't have a problem with the way it is.
Okay.
Mr. Leonardis, I'm sorry, you did have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Again, back to my previous point, it pertains strictly to the firearms language. They can still sell bowling balls and ping pong tables and badminton sets if they would like at that location. And if they want to continue, as Councilmember McNutt alluded to, sell firearms at one of the other parcels located in town, they're allowed to do that. This is, because of the excellent work of the ad hoc committee, not a stance against selling firearms in perpetuity. It's just what land use zones are appropriate. And I think I'm happy with the language as written.
All right, I'm going to thank the ad hoc committee. I want to thank staff, the council. I want to thank the community for a year of work. Some of you are happy, some of you are not. Probably no one is. But I thank you, and I will adjourn the meeting.